I was walking through the hospital parking lot, my mind heavy with the weight of my wife's failing health, when an older security guard stopped me. He looked at me with deep concern and asked, "Is that your wife?" I turned confused and nodded. He pulled me aside, leaned in and whispered, "You need to see this." As he showed me the security footage on his phone, my heart sank. What I saw was something I could never have imagined, and it shattered everything I thought I knew. My name is Emmanuel Griffin. I am 70 years old, and for the last 5 years I have lived entirely for my wife, Cynthia. I stepped down from my real estate development company to become her dedicated caregiver. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people you sacrificed everything for. Growing up, I learned the value of hard work. I built my company from the ground up, pouring my sweat into every single foundation. But none of that mattered when Cynthia was diagnosed with a rare muscular disease. I sold major assets and stepped away from my life's work, all to keep her comfortable. That Tuesday afternoon, I had just walked out of the billing department of the clinic after paying another exorbitant monthly fee. The sun was shining, but I felt nothing but exhaustion. Then Stan, the parking lot security guard I greeted every week, waved me over to his booth. "Mr. Griffin," Stan said, his voice tight with hesitation. "I always see you helping your wife into the wheelchair. I really think you need to look at what happened near the east exit 20 minutes ago." He handed me his smartphone, playing a recorded clip from the clinic's security cameras. The screen showed the east loading zone. The passenger door of my son-in-law Connor's luxury sport utility vehicle opened. I expected to see Cynthia struggling, needing assistance to stand. Instead, she stepped out of the vehicle with swift, perfect balance. She stood completely straight. There was no limp. There was no pain. There was no muscular atrophy. My breath caught in my throat. Cynthia, the woman I carried to the bathroom every single night, was wearing designer heels and laughing. Connor, the arrogant white real estate broker who married my daughter, leaned against the car hood. Next to him stood Megan, my son's snobby white wife, crossing her arms with a vicious smirk. Cynthia reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes and handed one to Connor and one to Megan. The audio on the security camera was crystal clear. Connor laughed, tucking the envelope into his tailored suit jacket. He said, "The old man is completely blind. By the end of this month, the entire trust fund will be ours." Megan rolled her eyes and added, "Just keep playing the dying swan, Cynthia. I cannot wait to bulldoze his precious properties." Cynthia smiled, a bright, malicious grin I had not seen in decades. She replied, "Do not worry. Emmanuel does whatever I tell him. He is too guilty about working so much in his younger years to ever question a sick woman." The video ended. Stan looked at me with deep pity. He murmured, "I am so sorry, Mr. Griffin." I stood there in the parking lot holding the phone. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone. 40 years of marriage, 5 years of agonizing medical routines, and it was all a perfectly orchestrated theatrical performance. They were draining me dry. I thanked Stan, handed his phone back, and walked to my car. My mind shifted from the grief of a devoted husband to the sharp, calculating focus of a civil engineer. They thought I was a senile, blind old man. They forgot that I spent my entire career inspecting foundations for structural flaws. Their foundation was built on lies, and I was going to tear it down completely. I drove home with perfect precision. When I walked through the front door of our estate, the performance was already back in full swing. The house was quiet, the blinds were drawn, and the smell of expensive lavender candles filled the air. I walked into the master bedroom. Cynthia was lying under a heavy duvet, moaning softly as if every single breath caused her immense physical pain. She looked at me with half-closed eyes and reached out a trembling hand. "Emmanuel," she whispered weakly, "the pain is so bad today. Did you get my new prescription?" I looked down at her. The woman who had been walking in high heels and laughing with my treacherous in-laws just an hour ago was now playing the victim perfectly. "Yes, my love," I said, keeping my voice entirely steady. "I got the medication." I walked over to her nightstand. It was covered in amber pill bottles. One specific bottle caught my attention. It was her specialty treatment. Just last month, I sold 2 of my most profitable apartment complexes in the city center to cover the imported medication and her upcoming treatments. Those buildings were my pride, but I liquidated them without a second thought because I believed I was buying my wife a few more years of life. I opened the bottle and took out one of the large blue capsules. I told her I was going to get her a glass of water. I stepped out of the room, slipped the capsule into my pocket, and replaced it with a standard vitamin from the kitchen cabinet. I brought her the water and the vitamin. She swallowed it with a dramatic grimace. I kissed her forehead, feeling absolute disgust, and told her I needed to run to the pharmacy to sort out a billing issue. I drove straight to a private medical testing laboratory across town. I paid for an expedited chemical analysis of the blue capsule. I sat in the sterile waiting room reflecting on the millions of dollars I had poured into her care. I had drained my liquid assets. I had altered my will to ensure she would be taken care of. I had given her complete control over the household finances so she would feel empowered despite her supposed illness. I had sacrificed my peaceful retirement to be her nurse. The laboratory technician called my name exactly 2 hours later. He handed me a printed report. "Mr. Griffin," he said with a confused look, "I am not sure what you paid for this medication, but there are no active pharmaceutical ingredients here. It is compressed sucrose and food coloring. It is literally a sugar pill." I stared at the paper. The confirmation was absolute. There was no rare disease. There was only a rare level of greed. I drove back to my house, the blueprint for my retaliation forming clearly in my mind. When I walked back into our bedroom, Cynthia was waiting. She reached out her hand again, her voice shaking with fake exhaustion. "Emmanuel," she murmured, "the doctor called while you were out. He says we need to start the new intensive chemotherapy protocol immediately. He needs a deposit of $100,000 by tomorrow." I looked at the woman I had loved for 40 years. I squeezed her hand gently and offered her a warm, reassuring smile. "Of course, Cynthia," I said smoothly. "Whatever you need. I will go to the bank first thing in the morning." I smiled at her, but in my mind her sentence was already signed. The next morning I walked through the heavy glass doors of First National Bank. I had done business with this institution for over 4 decades. My intention was to play my part perfectly. I needed to request the $100,000 withdrawal for Cynthia's fabricated chemotherapy, acting the role of the desperate grieving husband, willing to do anything to save his dying wife. I was directed immediately to the office of the branch manager, Arthur. Before I could even sit down or mention the medical funds, Arthur stood up beaming with a wide professional smile. He reached across his polished mahogany desk and shook my hand vigorously. "Congratulations on the new project," Emmanuel, Arthur said with genuine enthusiasm. "The $2 million commercial mortgage loan has been fully approved. The final underwriting went through an hour ago. Connor submitted the last of the paperwork yesterday afternoon." I froze. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I kept my face entirely impassive, relying on a skill I had perfected over decades of navigating cutthroat boardrooms. A $2 million mortgage. I had no pending loans. I owned everything I had free and clear, having paid off my final properties years ago. I took a slow, steady breath and offered Arthur a polite, measured smile. "Of course," I replied smoothly. "Connor has been handling the groundwork. I just wanted to review the final execution documents to ensure everything is perfectly aligned." Arthur nodded, completely unsuspecting, and handed me a thick manila folder. I opened it and scanned the pages rapidly. There it was, a massive commercial mortgage application leveraging my most valuable plot of land. At the bottom of the final page was my signature. It was an absolute masterpiece of forgery. The loops, the pressure points, and the angles were nearly identical to my actual handwriting. Connor, the slick real estate broker who had married my daughter Aaliyah, had unrestricted access to all my old contracts and archives. He had copied my signature flawlessly. They were not just draining my liquid cash through fake medical bills. They were actively mortgaging my real estate empire right out from under me. I stared at the property address listed on the loan documents, and a cold, violent fury ignited deep in my chest. This was not just any piece of commercial real estate. This was 50 acres of prime development land on the south side of the city. That land was the very foundation of my family legacy. My grandfather bought those 50 acres with cash during the absolute height of the Jim Crow era. He picked cotton, worked on the railroad, and endured daily, unimaginable humiliations to save every single penny. He faced down threats from white mobs who did not want a black man owning property in that district. He bled for that soil. When I inherited the land, I built my very first construction warehouse there, turning his blood and sweat into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. It was a monument to Black resilience and the absolute bedrock of the Griffin family wealth. And now, Connor, a privileged white man who had never worked a day of hard physical labor in his life, was using a forged signature to pawn off a century of my family's heritage. He intended to use the blood of my ancestors to fund his lavish lifestyle and his secret plans with my treacherous daughter-in-law, Megan. The sheer audacity of his racism and entitlement disguised as family business made my stomach churn. He looked at my family's historical legacy and saw nothing but a quick, unearned payday. My first instinct was to flip the heavy mahogany desk, demand the police be called, and have Connor arrested for federal bank fraud right then and there. But my mind quickly calculated the variables. If I blew the whistle right now, Connor would panic. He would hire expensive defense attorneys, claim it was a misunderstanding, and the bank would simply cancel the loan. He would walk away with a slap on the wrist, and Cynthia would continue her sick, manipulative charade from her fake deathbed. I did not want them to merely fail. I wanted them utterly destroyed. I looked up from the forged documents and smiled warmly at Arthur. "Everything looks exceptional, Arthur," I said, maintaining absolute composure. "However, I need to make an immediate change to the disbursement instructions." Arthur blinked, pulling up the digital file on his computer monitor. "Connor requested the funds be wired into the new joint corporate account tomorrow morning," Arthur noted. I shook my head and leaned forward, adopting the authoritative tone of the chief executive officer I truly was. That was the initial plan, I explained smoothly. But due to some new tax structuring, I require the entire $2 million to be routed into a different account. I took out my secure platinum card and read off the routing number for a private, highly encrypted offshore trust account. It was an account I had established decades ago, completely invisible to Cynthia Connor and the rest of the vultures circling my house. Because the loan was structured with Connor's business as the primary borrower, leveraging my land, via his forged guarantor documents, the debt legally belonged to him. Arthur did not question me. I was Emmanuel Griffin, the Titan who had brought millions to his branch over the years. He quickly updated the wire transfer destination in the system. "The funds will clear into your private offshore account by tomorrow at dawn," Arthur confirmed. I signed the revised disbursement form with my real signature, locking the trap firmly into place. Connor was about to be legally responsible for a $2 million debt with the bank, and the money was going straight into my impenetrable vault. I thanked Arthur, stood up, and walked out of the bank with a newfound sense of lethal clarity. I returned to my estate that evening carrying the weight of a loaded weapon. The dining room table was set with fine china and catered food. Cynthia was seated at the head of the table in her wheelchair, dressed in a silk robe, playing the role of the frail, suffering matriarch to perfection. Connor had come over for dinner, acting like the ultimate devoted son-in-law. He poured expensive red wine and offered me a bright, eager smile, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just hijacked his massive financial heist. The conversation flowed easily, filled with empty platitudes and fake concern for my well-being. I ate my steak slowly, watching the two of them perform their rehearsed script. After we finished the main course, Connor wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and cleared his throat dramatically. He reached down into his expensive leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. Emmanuel Connor began, his voice dripping with manufactured empathy. "I know how exhausted you are. You have been working so incredibly hard to take care of Cynthia. We want to ease your burden so you can finally rest." He slid the heavy stack of papers across the polished wood table toward me. I looked down at the bold, capitalized letters printed at the top of the very first page. It was a full medical and financial power of attorney. "Just sign right here at the bottom," Connor said, handing me a heavy silver luxury pen. "I will take over all the hospital bills, the property management, and the legal decisions. You will never have to worry about a single thing again." I stared at the silver pen, then at Connor's expectant face, and finally at Cynthia, who was nodding weakly in agreement with her hands trembling for dramatic effect. The absolute wickedness of their plan laid bare right in front of me. They did not just want my money anymore. They were actively trying to strip away my fundamental human rights. Signing that document would declare me legally incompetent, handing my entire existence over to a man who was actively robbing me. I held the pen in my hand, feeling the cold metal against my skin as a silent promise echoed in my mind. I stared at the bold print on the power of attorney document. Connor watched me with predatory anticipation, his fake smile barely masking his greed. Cynthia let out a perfectly timed, pathetic sigh from her wheelchair to pressure me. I tapped the heavy silver pen against the mahogany table. Then I reached up and patted my chest pocket. I left my reading glasses in the study, I said, my voice laced with the manufactured fatigue of an old, tired man. You know I cannot read the fine print without them, Connor, and I never sign a legal document without reading every single line of the fine print. Connor's jaw tightened. A flash of intense irritation crossed his pale eyes, but he quickly masked it with a forced understanding nod. Of course, Emmanuel. I can read it to you right now if you would like. I shook my head, standing up slowly and rubbing my lower back to sell the performance of physical decline. No, my eyes are entirely strained tonight. Leave the documents on the desk. I will review them first thing in the morning with a fresh cup of coffee. Cynthia let out a sharp breath, clearly annoyed by the delay, but she covered it with a sudden coughing fit. I poured her a glass of water, played the doting husband, and told them both good night. I retreated to the guest bedroom and closed the door firmly. I did not sleep a single minute. At 2 a.m, when the vast estate was completely silent and Cynthia was deep in her slumber, I opened my locked briefcase. Inside were 6 micro cameras and highly sensitive audio transmitters I had purchased earlier that day from a private security firm. My engineering background made the installation effortless. I moved like a ghost through my own home. I embedded a tiny high-definition lens inside the ornate crystal chandelier directly above Cynthia's bed. I placed a microscopic audio bug behind the heavy velvet drapes in the master suite. I wired the living room ceiling, molding the kitchen exhaust vent and the study bookshelf. Every blind spot was meticulously covered. By 4 a.m, my house was completely rigged. I had turned my multi-million-dollar estate into a surveillance fortress. I synced the camera feeds to a secure encrypted application on my smartphone. They thought I was a blind old man who needed looking after. I was about to see absolutely everything. At sunrise, I packed my fishing gear into the back of my truck. I walked into the master bedroom, kissed Cynthia's cheek, and told her I needed a few hours by the lake to clear my head and find some peace. She murmured a weak goodbye, barely opening her eyes, playing the exhausted victim flawlessly. I drove my truck to the local marina, parked facing the calm water, and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the encrypted application. The high-definition feed from the master bedroom illuminated my screen. Cynthia was no longer pretending to sleep. She was sitting straight up, vigorously applying expensive moisturizer to her hands and neck. Within 20 minutes, the bedroom door opened. 4 people walked in. Connor arrived first, slick and confident. My daughter Aaliyah followed, dressed in her designer business suit purchased with my money. Megan, my white daughter-in-law, walked in carrying a cup of artisan coffee. And finally, my biological son Xavier slouched into the room. Seeing Xavier standing there alongside the white in-laws who secretly despised our heritage felt like a physical blow to my chest. Xavier had always been my greatest disappointment. I had worked 18-hour shifts on dangerous construction sites to pay for his elite private education. I handed him every opportunity on a silver platter. He squandered every single one of them at the casino tables and the underground betting rings. He was drowning in massive gambling debts, completely morally bankrupt, and eager to sell his own father for a quick payout. Megan leaned against the footboard of the luxury bed, swirling her coffee. "Did the old fool sign the papers yet?" she asked, her tone dripping with absolute disdain. Cynthia sighed, adjusting her silk pillows with annoyance. "He forgot his glasses. He said he will read them today." Megan rolled her eyes, her underlying racism bubbling violently to the surface. "He is so ridiculously stubborn. I do not understand why he clings to that garbage plot of land on the south side anyway. It is nothing but a slum. My father's construction company is ready to bulldoze that entire ghetto and build a luxury shopping center. We just need his signature to transfer the title completely." Hearing her call the land my grandfather bled for a slum made my blood boil. That land was a monument to black survival during the Jim Crow era. Aaliyah, my own flesh and blood, nodded in agreement instead of defending her grandfather's sacred legacy. But it was Xavier who twisted the knife the deepest. Xavier laughed, a hollow, pathetic sound that echoed through my phone speaker. "My dad is just a relic," Xavier scoffed. "He still thinks hard work means something. He thinks that dirt is sacred because our great-grandfather picked cotton to buy it. It is pathetic. The land is worth millions, and he just sits on it playing the noble patriarch while I have debt collectors breathing down my neck. We need to cash him out and put him out to pasture. The betrayal was absolute and unforgivable. My children and their spouses were unified in their greed, laughing at the history and the blood that built their very comfortable lives. They saw me as nothing but a decaying obstacle blocking their inevitable payday. Connor paced across the bedroom floor, checking his heavy gold watch. "We cannot wait any longer," Connor stated firmly. "If he actually reads those power of attorney documents, he might realize we are seizing his liquid assets alongside the medical rights. We need his signature today, or the bank will flag the massive wire transfers I am planning." Cynthia smiled. It was a cold, calculated expression that made my stomach turn. She reached into her nightstand drawer and pulled out a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. "Do not worry about his reading glasses," Cynthia said, her voice steady and ruthless. "This afternoon, when he returns from the lake, I will ask him to make my special herbal tea. I will have Xavier slip these heavy sedatives into his cup. Once the medication hits his system, he will be completely groggy and incoherent. He will not be able to read a single word, let alone fight back." Cynthia tossed the vial to Xavier, who caught it with a greedy, satisfied grin. "We will not even ask him to sign," Cynthia finalized the sinister plan. "Once he passes out at the kitchen table, you just take his hand, press his thumb onto the red ink pad, and stamp his fingerprint on every single page of the legal documents. It will be completely binding and entirely legal." I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, staring unblinking at the screen. The lake in front of me was perfectly calm, but a violent storm was raging in my soul. They were planning to drug me, steal my identity, and strip away my entire life's work while I was unconscious. I turned off the phone screen. I started my engine and drove back toward my estate to drink my tea. I pulled my truck into the long, circular driveway of my estate, the crunch of gravel beneath my tires echoing the calculated rhythm of my heartbeat. I sat in the driver's seat for a few moments, staring at the grand facade of the house I had built with my own two hands. It was a beautiful structure, a testament to decades of relentless labor, but today it felt like walking directly into a viper's nest. I took a deep, steadying breath, burying the profound betrayal deep within my chest. I had to play the role of the exhausted, unsuspecting old man perfectly. The stakes were too high for a single misstep. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint classical music playing from the living room. I took off my coat and walked slowly toward the sitting area. Cynthia was positioned in her custom wheelchair near the large bay windows, bathed in the afternoon sunlight. A delicate porcelain tea set rested on the polished mahogany table in front of her. To her right sat Xavier, tapping his foot with barely contained nervous energy. Connor stood leaning against the fireplace mantel, trying to appear entirely casual, but his pale eyes tracked my every movement like a hawk watching its prey. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly suffocating, thick with their unspoken greed and toxic anticipation. "Emmanuel, you are back," Cynthia said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet manufactured fragility. She offered me a warm, loving smile that sent a shiver of absolute disgust down my spine. "I know you had a long morning at the lake. I made your favorite chamomile tea to help you relax. Please sit down and rest your bones." I approached the table, keeping my posture slightly hunched. The steam rising from the delicate porcelain cup carried the soothing scent of chamomile, but beneath it I knew there was a heavy chemical sedative designed to knock me completely unconscious. I lowered myself into the armchair opposite Cynthia. Xavier leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto the teacup. The silence in the room stretched out tight and dangerous. I reached out with both hands, adopting a slight age-induced tremor that I had practiced during my drive home. I picked up the hot cup, bringing it close to my face. I looked directly into Cynthia's eyes, searching for even a fraction of guilt, a single ounce of remorse for poisoning her husband of 40 years. There was absolutely nothing. Only the cold, calculating gaze of a predator waiting for the poison to take effect. "Thank you, my love," I said softly. "You always know exactly what I need." I brought the edge of the porcelain to my lips. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Connor hold his breath. Just as the liquid was about to touch my mouth, I violently jerked my wrist. I let out a startled gasp as the teacup tilted sharply. A large splash of the hot, sedated liquid cascaded over the rim, completely missing my mouth and splashing directly onto the center of her prized hand-woven Persian rug. "Oh, my deepest apologies, Cynthia," I stammered, making my voice shake with genuine-sounding distress. "My grip is simply failing me today. I am so incredibly clumsy. Look at what I have done to your beautiful rug." Cynthia's mask of the frail, loving wife slipped for a fraction of a second. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage crossed her face at the sight of her expensive rug being ruined. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her knuckles turning white. "It is fine, Emmanuel." She snapped her tone momentarily sharp before she caught herself and softened it back into a weak murmur. "It is just a rug. But we must clean the liquid before it stains the silk fibers. The special fabric cleaner is right behind me in the bottom drawer of the credenza." I pointed a shaking finger toward the cabinet. "I cannot bend down to reach it with my bad back, my love. Could you reach it for me?" Cynthia let out a sharp sigh of annoyance. She gripped the wheels of her chair and spun around aggressively, facing the wooden credenza behind her. Xavier instinctively looked toward his mother to help her. Connor shifted his weight momentarily, distracted by the sudden commotion. I had a window of exactly 3 seconds. With lightning speed and precision that betrayed my supposed old age, I grabbed the teacup and dumped the entire remaining contents directly into the soil of the massive potted ficus plant resting beside my armchair. I placed the nearly empty cup back onto its saucer with a soft clink just as Cynthia spun her wheelchair back around, clutching a white cloth. I leaned back into the plush fabric of the armchair. I let out a long, heavy exhale, making sure they heard the sound. I closed my eyes halfway, allowing my eyelids to flutter rapidly. I let my head loll slightly to the side, releasing all the tension in my neck and shoulders. "I feel suddenly so incredibly tired, Cynthia," I slurred, dragging out the syllables to mimic the onset of a heavy narcotic. "The room is spinning. I just need to rest my eyes for a moment." I let my chin drop heavily onto my chest. I relaxed my arms, letting them fall limply over the sides of the chair. I slowed my breathing down to a deep, rhythmic crawl, perfectly simulating a drug-induced stupor. I was entirely blind to the room, but my hearing became sharp and acutely focused. "He is out," Connor whispered from across the room, his voice entirely devoid of the respectful tone he used to my face. "That sedative works fast." I heard the squeak of Cynthia's wheelchair moving closer. "Get the documents out of the briefcase," she commanded coldly. "We do not have all day. If he wakes up groggy and realizes what is happening, this entire plan falls apart. Do it now, Xavier." Heavy, hesitant footsteps approached my chair. I could smell the strong, expensive designer cologne Xavier bathed himself in. He was standing right next to me. As I sat there feigning unconsciousness, a profound and crushing sorrow washed over me. I remembered the blistering heat of the summer sun beating down on my back 30 years ago. I remembered working consecutive 18-hour shifts, pouring concrete and laying steel rebar. My hands used to bleed through my work gloves, heavily calloused and permanently scarred from the brutal physical labor. I broke my own body so that Xavier would never have to lift a hammer. I paid tens of thousands of dollars in cash to send him to an elite private academy across town. I wanted my black son to have every single educational advantage in a corporate world built for white men like Connor. I sacrificed my youth, my energy, and my health to build a fortress of wealth so he could walk into any room with his head held high. And this was the return on my lifelong investment. I felt his soft, perfectly manicured hands grab my thick, calloused wrist. He did not hesitate. He did not utter a single word of apology to the father who gave him everything. I heard the sharp, distinct snap of a plastic lid being pulled open. The pungent chemical smell of fresh ink drifted into my nose. He was holding a red ink pad. "Give me his thumb," Connor instructed quietly. "Press it down hard. We need a perfectly clear print on the guarantor signature line or the bank might flag the commercial mortgage application." Xavier forcefully pressed my right thumb into the wet ink pad. Then he guided my limp hand downward. He pressed my thumb firmly against the thick, crisp parchment paper resting on the mahogany table. He held it there for 3 seconds, rocking my thumb slightly to ensure the fingerprint was entirely legible. He repeated the exact same process 4 more times, stamping away my rights, my properties, and my legacy with absolute clinical detachment. "Got it," Xavier finally whispered, dropping my arm back over the side of the chair. "The prints are perfect." Connor let out a long, victorious breath. "Outstanding work, Xavier. I will overnight these directly to the bank underwriter right now. The $2 million wire transfer will be fully authorized by tomorrow morning. We just bought ourselves a massive empire." "Leave him in the chair," Cynthia ordered heartlessly. "Let him sleep off the drugs. If he wakes up confused later, I will tell him he had a bad reaction to his blood pressure medication. Go celebrate. You boys earned it." I heard the front door open and close as Connor and Xavier left the house, taking the forged documents with them. I remained perfectly still for another hour, listening to the silence of the room, letting the betrayal harden into an unbreakable armor around my heart. I was no longer a father. I was no longer a husband. I was an architect of total destruction, and they had just handed me the master blueprints. The next morning, the bright sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the guest bedroom. I had woken up early, locked the door, and immediately opened the highly secure banking application on my smartphone. I bypassed the two-factor authentication and logged directly into my private offshore trust portal. I stared at the screen, waiting for the system to refresh. At exactly 8 in the morning, a bright green notification banner illuminated my phone. An incoming wire transfer had successfully cleared the international clearinghouse. $2 million had been fully deposited into my hidden account. The bank had processed Connor's fraudulent commercial mortgage application. He had officially leveraged his own corporate entity against my land, taking on a massive legally binding $2 million debt under his own name. But because of the swift change I made in Arthur's office, the actual cash bypassed Connor's greedy hands entirely and landed safely inside my impenetrable vault. Downstairs, the faint, unmistakable sound of a champagne cork popping echoed up the hallway. I could hear the loud, obnoxious laughter of Connor, Megan, Xavier, and Aaliyah drifting up from the kitchen. They were clinking expensive crystal glasses together, toasting to their brilliant deception. They were gleefully celebrating the acquisition of a fortune they believed would secure their lavish lifestyles forever. They were cheering for their flawless victory, completely, blissfully unaware that the millions they were celebrating had already vanished into thin air. They thought they had trapped a senile old man. They did not realize that the steel jaws of my trap had just snapped completely shut around their necks. I walked down the grand staircase, maintaining a slow, shuffling gait to preserve my performance. The sharp clinking of crystal glasses stopped immediately. Connor quickly hid a bottle of expensive champagne behind the kitchen island. Aaliyah, my own daughter, stepped forward with a bright, entirely fake smile plastered across her face. She linked her arm through mine and gently guided me toward the living room sofa. She told me she was deeply worried about my health after I supposedly passed out from my blood pressure medication yesterday afternoon. She claimed she had reached out to a top-tier medical specialist to conduct a private and home consultation to ensure I was completely fine. A man walked into the living room holding a sleek leather clipboard. He wore a crisp white lab coat over a tailored designer suit, but his posture was far too arrogant for a seasoned medical professional. Aaliyah introduced him as Dr. Harrison Vance, a highly respected neurologist. My memory, sharpened by decades of navigating corporate networking events, instantly placed his face. He was not a renowned medical expert. He was one of Connor's old fraternity brothers from their university days. I had seen him in the background of their wedding photos, drinking heavily at the reception and making a fool of himself. This was their next calculated move. They were fabricating a medical trail to legally validate the power of attorney they had stolen from me while I was pretending to be unconscious. They needed a doctor to declare me insane, so the banks and the courts would never question Connor taking over my entire financial empire. The absolute disrespect burned a hole in my chest, but I channeled that white-hot rage into the performance of a lifetime. Dr. Vance sat in the armchair across from me, crossing his legs with a smug, self-satisfied expression. He did not bother checking my heart rate, my blood pressure, or any of my basic vitals. Instead, he dove straight into a series of deeply insulting, rudimentary cognitive questions designed specifically to humiliate me on the record. He spoke to me slowly and loudly, enunciating every single syllable as if I were a deaf toddler. "Emmanuel," he said with a dripping, patronizing tone, "can you tell me what year it is? Do you know who the current president is? Can you point to your daughter and tell me her name?" I let my jaw go completely slack. I stared blankly at the wall behind his head, intentionally letting my eyes glaze over so they looked hollow and vacant. I opened my mouth and let out a confused, raspy stammer. I looked directly at Aaliyah, the daughter I had raised, funded, and protected, and I called her by the name of my late mother. I raised my trembling hands and intentionally knocked a glass of ice water off the side table. I watched it shatter into a dozen pieces on the hardwood floor, acting completely startled by the noise. I mumbled nonsensical phrases about needing to go to work at a construction site I had not visited in over 40 years. The physical toll of acting like a broken, helpless man was exhausting, but I did not break character for a single second. Cynthia sat in her wheelchair in the corner of the room, burying her face in her hands. She pretended to weep uncontrollably at my tragic cognitive decline, playing the role of the devastated, loyal wife. Dr. Vance clicked his expensive pen and swiftly checked several boxes on his official-looking medical form. He did not even pause to evaluate my supposed symptoms or conduct a secondary test. He simply scribbled his signature at the bottom of the page with a flourish. He looked at my treacherous family with a grave, heavily rehearsed expression. "I am incredibly sorry," Dr. Vance announced, softly putting a hand on Connor's shoulder. "His dementia is severely advanced. The neurological degradation is rapid and irreversible. He is entirely incapable of managing his own affairs, his finances, or understanding his surroundings. He requires full-time legal and medical guardianship immediately for his own safety." Aaliyah wiped a fake tear from her cheek and thanked the fraud profusely. I was escorted back to my bedroom like a fragile, mindless prisoner. They closed the heavy wooden door behind me, genuinely believing they had successfully locked the final chain around my life. I listened to their footsteps retreat down the hallway. I immediately dropped the confused act. My posture straightened and my eyes narrowed with absolute clarity. I walked quietly over to my desk and opened the secure surveillance application on my smartphone. I pulled up the high-definition camera feed hidden inside the hallway smoke detector. Connor was escorting his college buddy toward the front door. Once they were out of sight of the living room, both men dropped their solemn, devastated faces. Connor laughed quietly and slapped Vance on the shoulder like they were back at a college football tailgate. Connor reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope. He shoved it directly into the fake doctor's hands. "There is $10,000 in cash right there," Connor whispered, his voice captured flawlessly by the microscopic audio transmitter I had installed in the ceiling molding. "You guarantee this medical certificate will hold up in a probate court?" Vance pocketed the thick envelope with a greedy, arrogant smirk. "Absolutely," Vance replied, adjusting his white coat. "I put my medical license on it. I filled out the proper diagnostic codes. With those forged fingerprints from yesterday and this official diagnosis, you officially own him, Connor. The old man is a ghost." They shook hands and Vance walked out the front door. They had just handed me the exact rope I needed to hang them all. They thought they were writing my concluding chapter, but they were simply handing me the ink to sign their arrest warrants. Later that afternoon, under the pretense of taking a supervised, heavily sedated nap, I slipped out through the private side entrance of the estate. I avoided the main cameras I knew Cynthia monitored and walked to the next street over. I drove my secondary vehicle, an older sedan they did not track, to a sleek glass office building in the center of the financial district. I walked straight into the private executive suite of Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was my longtime corporate attorney and one of the most ruthless, brilliant legal minds in the entire city. He had handled my multi-million-dollar land acquisition, zoning disputes, and corporate structuring for over 20 years. He was fiercely loyal, completely discreet, and fully aware of the trap I was currently building around my family. I sat across from Jonathan's massive desk and handed him a secure digital flash drive. It contained the hallway video of the bribe, the audio recording of the cash transaction, the clear visual of Dr. Vance admitting his fraud, and the undeniable proof of the fake doctor's true identity. Jonathan plugged the drive into his secure terminal. He watched Connor hand over the $10,000 bribe in crisp $100 bills. He listened to the two men laugh about stealing my freedom. A sharp, dangerous smile spread across Jonathan's face. He clasped his hands together and looked at me with deep, professional respect. "This is federal medical fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and severe elder abuse," Jonathan stated clearly, leaning back in his leather chair. "We have them dead to rights, Emmanuel. The evidence is absolutely bulletproof. I can file these injunctions with a federal judge in exactly 1 hour. The police will have your son-in-law, your daughter, and that fake doctor in handcuffs before dinner. I can freeze Cynthia's accounts immediately." I shook my head slowly, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city skyline I had helped build with my own 2 hands. "Not yet, Jonathan," I replied with absolute icy calm. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my restraint. "We have the kill shot right here, Emmanuel. Why wait? If we strike now, they will only face a few criminal charges," I explained, turning my gaze back to my trusted lawyer. "They will hire expensive defense attorneys with the money they have already stolen from my charity accounts. They will claim it was a misunderstanding or blame each other to get reduced sentences. I do not want to merely send them to prison, Jonathan. I want to watch them systematically destroy each other. I want to strip away their pride, their money, and their fake social status. I want them to feel the exact same absolute helplessness they tried to force upon me when they stamped my thumb onto that paper. Jonathan nodded slowly, a dark understanding settling in his eyes. You want them to walk onto the ice so far out that they can never run back to the shore. Exactly, I confirmed. Let them file the medical certificate with the probate court. Let them take over the fake shell accounts I set up. Let Aaliyah believe she has conquered my charity fund. Let Connor believe he has secured the $2 million loan on my land. Let them feel utterly and completely invincible. We do not pull the net until they are drowning in the dead center of it. Jonathan leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional admiration to a deep, sympathetic gravity. He reached into his heavy oak desk drawer and pulled out a separate red-bonded folder. I thought our strategy session was finished, but Jonathan slid the file across the polished desk toward me. He told me his forensic accountants had been running a parallel audit on all my connected corporate entities just as a standard precaution given Connor's forgery. They had flagged massive, undeniable irregularities in the Griffin Educational Foundation. My breath caught sharply in my chest. The Griffin Educational Foundation was my most sacred and cherished endeavor. I established that scholarship fund 30 years ago, using the profits from my very first major commercial development. It was specifically designed to provide full-ride college scholarships to underprivileged black youth in our city. It was my personal mission to reach back and pull the next generation up the ladder, giving them the exact opportunities that were denied to my grandfather. I opened the red folder. The spreadsheets inside were highlighted with aggressive yellow markers. Over the past 8 months, exactly $500,000 had been systematically siphoned out of the charity accounts. I looked up at Jonathan, my voice dangerously quiet as I asked who authorized these massive transfers. Jonathan did not blink. He stated that Aaliyah, my own daughter, had used her position as the fund's vice president to create a network of shell vendor invoices. She had embezzled $500,000 intended for the education of impoverished children. The forensic trace showed exactly where the stolen money went. She bought limited edition designer handbags, chartered private jets for luxury vacations with Connor, and quietly paid off a massive chunk of Connor's underwater real estate debts. My own flesh and blood was stealing the future of struggling black teenagers to fund her white husband's failing business ventures and fill her own closet with expensive leather goods. The betrayal was so profound, it physically ached. She was taking from our community to buy the approval of a man who secretly mocked our heritage. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the executive office. I closed the red folder and rested my calloused hands on top of it. The pain of a father realizing his daughter is entirely morally bankrupt is a unique kind of agonizing torture. I had given Aaliyah the world, and she responded by robbing the most vulnerable people in our city. I could have instructed Jonathan to hand the audit directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation right then. They would have raided her luxury home by midnight, but simply having her arrested would not force her to face the true crushing weight of her actions. I needed to lock the cage from the inside. I looked at Jonathan and issued a new, highly specific directive. I told him to draft a comprehensive transfer of authority for the Griffin Educational Foundation. I wanted a legally binding document that named Aaliyah as the sole executive director and primary fiduciary of the entire charity. Jonathan frowned, warning me that giving her total unsupervised control would allow her to drain the remaining funds completely dry. I corrected him. I explained that by legally transferring sole directorship to her right now, she would officially inherit all the liabilities, tax burdens, and federal compliance requirements. Once she signed that document, the embezzlement she had already committed would become her exclusive, undeniable legal responsibility. She would be the only authorized signature on a rapidly sinking ship. When the federal authorities inevitably reviewed the ledger, there would be no shared blame. Jonathan smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile and immediately began drafting the paperwork. I returned to my estate that evening, holding the freshly printed legal documents in my trembling hands. I found Aaliyah sitting in the formal dining room typing away on her expensive laptop while sipping imported sparkling water. I adopted my shuffling, unsteady walk, letting my shoulders slump heavily as I approached her. I placed the documents on the table with a shaking hand. I looked at her with wide, tired eyes and told her that my memory was slipping too fast these days. I said I could no longer handle the complex financial paperwork of the charity and that I needed her to take over completely. I played the role of a defeated, confused old man begging his capable, brilliant daughter for help. Aaliyah looked down at the papers, and a smug, victorious gleam lit up her eyes. She tried to compose her face into a mask of dutiful concern, but the corners of her mouth twitched with suppressed delight. She genuinely believed she had completely fooled her senile father. She placed a manicured hand over mine and told me not to worry about a single thing, promising she would take excellent care of my legacy. She grabbed a pen and eagerly signed her name on every single dotted line, officially taking total legal ownership of her own federal crimes. She did not bother to read the liability clauses carefully. Her greed made her completely blind to the trap closing around her ankles. I thanked her weakly and slowly walked back to my bedroom. As soon as I closed my solid wood door, my secure phone buzzed with an encrypted alert from Jonathan's banking monitors. The ink on the transfer document was barely dry, and Aaliyah had already abused her new unchecked power. The alert confirmed she had just wired another $100,000 from the charity directly into her personal checking account. She was drunk on her own greed, completely unaware that she had just committed another count of federal wire fraud while I was watching her every move. She thought she was draining my lifeblood, but she was simply digging her own prison cell a little bit deeper. The next morning, Aaliyah strutted into the kitchen with an air of absolute, undeniable superiority. She poured herself a cup of expensive coffee and loudly announced her newest brilliant idea to Connor and Megan. Drunk on her new, undisputed power as the head of the foundation, she declared she was going to host a massive charity gala next month. It was an obvious glittering vanity project. She wanted to rent out the most expensive ballroom in the financial district, invite all her wealthy superficial friends, and parade herself in front of the local media as the new glamorous face of the Griffin family philanthropy. She framed it to me as a vital fundraiser to help the children, but it was purely an exercise in feeding her own massive ego. She wanted to show off her power, secure her social status, and firmly establish her dominance over my life's work. I sat at the kitchen table sipping my tea with a blank, vacant expression. I nodded along to her grand plans, offering a weak, supportive smile as she detailed the champagne fountains and the crystal centerpieces she intended to buy with the stolen scholarship money. Inside, my mind was running through 1,000 flawless calculations. Let her rent the grand ballroom. Let her invite the press and the city elites. Let her put on the most expensive designer dress she could buy with stolen funds. Aaliyah was unknowingly building the perfect, highly publicized stage for her own spectacular downfall. I would let her climb to the very top of her imaginary throne before I burned the entire castle to the ground. The night of the grand charity gala arrived exactly 1 month later. Aaliyah had spared absolutely no expense utilizing the stolen scholarship funds to rent the most opulent ballroom in the downtown financial district. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings and tables were draped in imported silk. But the true spectacle of the evening was the role they forced me to play. That afternoon, Cynthia and Megan had entered my room holding a deeply insulting, oversized tweed suit. It was at least 2 sizes too large, hanging off my shoulders like a deflated balloon. They wanted me to look frail, shrunken, and entirely pathetic. To complete their manufactured tragedy, Connor rolled a standard hospital wheelchair into my bedroom. I am perfectly capable of walking, but Aaliyah insisted that the optics of a wheelchair would drastically increase the charitable donations. She needed the wealthy elite of the city to see her as the valiant, self-sacrificing daughter taking over the heavy burden of her dying father's legacy. I allowed Connor to lift me into the chair. I slumped my shoulders, let my head droop, and allowed a blank, vacant expression to take over my face. As we entered the glittering ballroom, the flash of cameras blinded me. The city's wealthiest socialites, politicians, and business magnates swarmed around us, offering me condescending smiles and hollow words of pity. Aaliyah paraded me around like a tragic prop, wiping away invisible tears as she recounted my fictitious mental decline to anyone who would listen. The humiliation of sitting in that chair wearing a clownish suit and listening to my own daughter exploit my life's work to feed her massive ego was a bitter pill to swallow. I sat in silence at the front table, gripping the armrests of the wheelchair. They thought they were parading a defeated king, but they were simply placing themselves perfectly in the crosshairs of my retaliation. Halfway through the evening, Aaliyah took center stage. The ballroom dimmed, leaving only a harsh spotlight illuminating her custom designer gown. She gripped the podium and delivered a tear-jerking, heavily rehearsed speech about my supposed battle with rapid dementia. She spoke about the heavy burden of leadership and how she was nobly stepping up to guide the Griffin Educational Foundation into a new era of philanthropy. The crowd was captivated, murmuring in sympathetic agreement. I watched her wipe a perfectly timed crocodile tear from her cheek, sickened by her flawless deception. Meanwhile, Megan and Connor were standing backstage, waiting to present the inaugural donation check. What Megan did not realize was that the sound technician had already activated her wireless lapel microphone. As Aaliyah paused for dramatic effect, a sharp, arrogant voice suddenly echoed through the massive ballroom speakers. It was Megan. Her voice cut through the silence with absolute venomous clarity. "Just keep crying, Aaliyah," Megan sneered backstage, completely unaware her words were broadcasting to 500 people. "God, I cannot wait for this charade to be over. Once the old man finally dies, my dad's company can bulldoze that entire South Side ghetto. That land is going to make us filthy rich." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy donors froze their champagne glasses, halted halfway to their lips. On stage, Aaliyah's face drained of all color. She scrambled frantically, waving her hands at the sound booth to cut the audio feed. A piercing screech of feedback echoed through the room as the technician scrambled to kill Megan's microphone, but the damage was already permanently done. The ugly racist truth about their intentions for my grandfather's sacred land had just been broadcast to the city's elite. I sat in my wheelchair, my head still lowered in my fake stupor, but my hand was steady inside my oversized jacket pocket. My smartphone had been recording the entire event. I captured the pristine, unedited audio of Megan's racist, predatory confession. They had just publicly humiliated themselves and handed me the exact audio evidence I needed to destroy their corporate reputation. Aaliyah rushed through the rest of her speech, the atmosphere in the room completely poisoned. The gala they thought would secure their high society status had just turned into a spectacular public relations disaster. While the gala descended into awkward, hurried farewells, my biological son Xavier was dealing with a much more immediate crisis. He had been pacing the dark corridors outside the ballroom all evening, sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo. My hidden surveillance applications had cloned his phone notifications weeks ago, allowing me to intercept his incoming messages. His underground gambling debts had reached a critical terminal breaking point. A violent syndicate on the east side had officially run out of patience. As the remaining guests filed out of the hotel, Xavier's phone rang. I listened to the intercepted call through my secure earpiece. A cold, gravelly voice on the other end did not ask for money. The man simply stated that Xavier had exactly 48 hours to produce the $150,000 he owed, or they were going to break both of his legs and start mailing pieces of him to his wife. Xavier pleaded, his voice cracking with absolute terror. He promised them he had a massive payday coming soon, begging for just a few more days. The line went dead. Xavier was completely backed into a corner, trapped between ruthless loan sharks and his own crippling financial failures. He needed a massive infusion of cash immediately, and I knew exactly where he intended to get it. We returned to the estate shortly after midnight. The house was tense, filled with the venomous fallout of Megan's open microphone disaster. Cynthia immediately demanded sedatives and went to bed furious that their perfect public image had been shattered. I was wheeled into my room and left alone in the dark. But I did not sleep. I sat in front of my encrypted surveillance monitors, watching the hidden cameras strategically placed throughout the property. At 2 a.m, a shadow moved across the feed from the underground garage. It was Xavier. He was dressed in dark clothes, clutching a heavy steel flashlight and a pair of industrial wire cutters. My heart turned to pure ice as I watched my own flesh and blood creep toward my vintage luxury sedan, the only vehicle I still drove on the rare occasions Cynthia allowed me to leave the house alone. Xavier slid underneath the heavy chassis of the car. The high-definition camera captured his every movement. He reached up with the wire cutters and clamped down hard on the primary hydraulic brake lines. With a sharp metallic snap, the thick cables gave way. A steady drip of brake fluid began pooling on the concrete floor. Xavier wiped the sweat from his forehead and quickly crawled out from under the vehicle, slipping back into the shadows of the house. He was not just waiting for me to succumb to fake dementia anymore. His gambling debts had accelerated his timeline. He knew I had a $3 million accidental death life insurance policy, a policy he and Aaliyah had secretly named themselves the primary beneficiaries of months ago. Xavier had just crossed the absolute point of no return. He had moved from financial fraud directly to premeditated attempted murder. I stared at the screen, watching the dark puddle of brake fluid expand across the garage floor. They wanted a fatal accident. I was going to give them exactly that. The sun rose over the sprawling estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the immaculate pavement of my driveway. I walked down the interior steps leading into the underground garage, the cool morning air, a stark, biting contrast to the boiling anger radiating inside my chest. There, directly beneath the heavy steel chassis of my vintage luxury sedan, lay the dark, viscous puddle of hydraulic brake fluid. Xavier had done his job with the sloppy, rushed desperation of a man drowning in his own manufactured ruin. He had left a glaring trail of physical evidence that perfectly mirrored his crumbling, pathetic life. Any normal man in my position would have immediately picked up his phone, dialed the emergency hotline, and waited for the police to arrive. But I was not a normal man, and standard justice was far too swift and entirely too clean for what my treacherous family truly deserved. If I called the authorities right now, Xavier would simply hire a lawyer, claim he was attempting to perform routine maintenance, or deny his involvement entirely. The investigation would drag on for months in a bureaucratic purgatory. I needed irrefutable, undeniable proof of an attempted assassination. I needed the crime to be fully executed so the trap could snap shut with lethal precision. I reached out and pulled open the heavy driver's side door. The pristine leather interior smelled of polished mahogany and old cherished memories, a sharp contrast to the metal death trap my own biological son had just turned it into. I slid behind the steering wheel and inserted the silver key into the ignition. The engine roared to life with a smooth, powerful hum that vibrated through my bones. I knew exactly what was at stake. I was gambling my own physical life against their desperate desire for a $3 million life insurance payout. But a master engineer knows the exact stress tolerances of his building materials. I shifted the heavy vehicle into drive and slowly rolled out of the garage, leaving the dark puddle of brake fluid behind me in the shadows. I navigated the quiet early morning streets with extreme calculated caution. I utilized the emergency handbrake and the natural friction of the heavy engine block to strictly control my speed. Every single intersection was a massive calculated risk, and every downhill slope was a grueling test of my iron will. I had a very specific, highly strategic destination in mind. 2 miles away, located directly adjacent to the district fire station, was a thick, dense row of mature cedar hedges planted securely in front of a soft earth embankment. It was the perfect, highly visible stage for my manufactured tragedy. As I approached the final stretch of asphalt leading toward the station, I forcefully pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The heavy sedan picked up speed rapidly, the engine revving loudly as the speedometer climbed. I pressed my foot down on the brake pedal. It went straight to the floorboard with zero resistance. The hydraulic line was completely dead. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, my heart pounding with a cold, highly controlled adrenaline. I aimed the heavy steel hood of the car precisely at the thickest, most forgiving section of the cedar hedge. I braced my arms against the wheel, tightened my core muscles, and intentionally slammed the side of my forehead against the padded edge of the steering column just a fraction of a second before the impact. The crash was incredibly violent. The airbags deployed with a deafening explosive crack, instantly filling the enclosed cabin with a thick, white powder. The heavy vehicle plowed fiercely through the dense branches, snapping wood and tearing foliage, before slamming into the soft dirt embankment and coming to a sudden, jarring halt. Blood trickled warmly down the side of my face from the superficial, self-inflicted gash on my forehead. Through the shattered, spider-webbed glass of the windshield, I could already see the massive red bay doors of the fire station rolling open. Uniformed paramedics and firefighters were sprinting toward my smoking vehicle within 30 seconds of the impact. The trap was sprung flawlessly. As the rescue team pulled me from the wreckage and placed me onto a mobile stretcher, I reached into my jacket pocket and handed the lead paramedic a pre-written, heavily funded towing instruction card. I demanded that my destroyed vehicle be towed exclusively to a specific private address on the industrial east side of the city. It was an independent auto repair shop owned by Marcus, a man I had known and trusted for over 40 years. Marcus was a master mechanic who had maintained all the heavy transport machinery for my very first commercial construction sites. He was a man of absolute unbreakable integrity who owed his initial business loan to my silent financial backing decades ago. While the paramedics loaded me into the back of the flashing ambulance, Marcus was already waiting to receive my ruined sedan. I had sent him a secure encrypted message right before I started the engine at my estate. Marcus did exactly what I paid him to do. He hoisted the heavy vehicle onto his hydraulic lift and immediately located the severed brake lines. He took high-definition macro photographs of the fresh, pinched metal cuts. The distinct inward indentation marks left by Xavier's industrial wire cutters were undeniably clear. It was not a mechanical failure caused by age or wear. It was a deliberate manual severance. Marcus compiled a detailed ironclad forensic mechanical report, signed his name to it, and had it legally notarized within the hour. He sent the encrypted digital file directly to my lawyer, Jonathan Pierce. I now held the absolute forensic proof of premeditated attempted murder in my hands. The physical evidence was entirely secured. The harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the emergency room glared overhead as the attending trauma nurses carefully bandaged my bleeding forehead. My physical injuries were purely cosmetic, but I maintained the rigid posture of a severely shaken, terrified, and confused old man. I stared blankly at the medical monitors, playing my part to absolute perfection. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the trauma ward swung open violently, hitting the wall with a loud bang. My entire treacherous family burst into the emergency room. Cynthia was being pushed in her wheelchair by Connor, her face a mask of manufactured panic. Megan, Aaliyah, and Xavier followed closely behind her, rushing toward my hospital bed. I ignored the others and watched Xavier's face intently. As his eyes locked onto me, sitting up in the hospital bed, alive, breathing, and looking directly back at him, all the blood completely drained from his face. The profound disappointment and sheer, suffocating panic radiating from my biological son was palpable. His hands visibly shook at his sides. He had bet his entire life, his freedom, and his massive gambling debts on my violent death, and he had just lost absolutely everything. He stared at the bandage on my head, realizing that his amateur assassination attempt had spectacularly failed. Cynthia, instantly realizing that the massive $3 million life insurance payout had just vanished into thin air, immediately pivoted her sinister strategy. Her eyes widened with a terrifying, weaponized horror. She spun her wheelchair around and forcefully grabbed the white sleeve of the attending emergency room physician. "Doctor, you must listen to me right now," Cynthia cried out, her voice echoing loudly through the crowded, chaotic hospital ward. "My husband is completely out of his mind. He is suffering from severe advanced dementia and severe paranoia. He just intentionally crashed his own car into a wall trying to kill himself. He is a massive, unpredictable danger to himself and the public. We have the official legal medical certificates from a top neurologist to prove his cognitive decline." She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest, putting on the performance of a devastated, terrified wife. "You have to lock him in a secure, closed psychiatric ward right now," she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "Do not let him leave this hospital. We have his medical power of attorney, and I am officially committing him." The attending emergency room physician looked completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of my family's chaotic demands. Cynthia sat in her wheelchair, weeping with flawless theatrical precision, while Connor slammed the forged medical power of attorney and Dr. Vance's fake neurological certificate directly onto the stainless steel triage counter. The doctor, a young and clearly exhausted resident, scanned the heavily stamped legal documents. Fear of medical liability and massive corporate lawsuits washed over his face. He looked at me, an older man with a bleeding forehead who had just driven a heavy luxury sedan into a brick embankment. The fabricated narrative fit the visual evidence perfectly. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Griffin," the doctor said, his voice laced with genuine pity. "Based on these official diagnostic reports and the legal authority held by your wife, I have absolutely no choice. For your own safety and the safety of the public, I am placing you under a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold. We are going to transfer you to the high-security locked psychiatric wing on the 4th floor until a state-appointed evaluator can review your case." Cynthia let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, gripping Connor's hand as if they had just survived a terrible ordeal. Megan and Aaliyah exchanged a quick, victorious glance. Xavier simply stared at the floor, sweating profusely, knowing his physical assassination attempt had morphed into a permanent legal imprisonment. They had won. They truly believed they had successfully locked me in a padded cell, stripping me of my civil rights and my entire financial empire in one single, ruthless stroke. I did not fight back. I did not raise my voice, nor did I demand to speak to a lawyer. Any sign of resistance, anger, or extreme lucidity would simply be categorized as a manic episode by the hospital staff. I slumped my shoulders, let my jaw hang loose, and allowed two large orderlies to lift me into a transport wheelchair. I kept my head bowed as they rolled me into the sterile, heavily guarded elevator. The heavy metal doors closed, separating me from my treacherous family. They walked out of the hospital to celebrate their inheritance. I was wheeled into a stark, windowless holding room on the 4th floor. The heavy steel door clicked shut, the electronic deadbolt engaging with a loud final thud. I sat in the silence of the psychiatric holding cell, counting the seconds. I knew my imprisonment was merely temporary. I had anticipated this exact maneuver the moment Dr. Vance signed that fraudulent paper. The clock on the pale green wall ticked past midnight. The hospital ward was completely silent, heavily sedated, and securely locked down. Suddenly, the electronic deadbolt on my door snapped open with a sharp, heavy clack. The heavy steel door swung wide open. Jonathan Pierce, my ruthless corporate attorney, strode into the small room. He was not wearing his usual tailored business suit. He was dressed in a dark tactical overcoat flanked by 4 massive, heavily armed private security contractors. Jonathan did not look like a man here to negotiate a settlement. He looked like a general leading an extraction operation. Behind him, the hospital's chief psychiatric director and the overnight legal administrator were scrambling down the hallway, their faces pale with absolute terror. "You cannot just take a committed patient, Mr. Pierce," the hospital director stammered, waving a clipboard frantically. "We have a legally binding medical directive from his wife." Jonathan stopped, turning slowly to face the trembling hospital administrator. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed legal document bearing the official embossed gold seal of the state Supreme Court. "This is an emergency federal injunction and an immediate writ of habeas corpus signed directly by a Supreme Court justice exactly 20 minutes ago." Jonathan stated, his voice echoing through the quiet ward with lethal authority. "The medical power of attorney filed by Cynthia Griffin is currently the subject of an active high-level federal fraud investigation. You are currently holding my client against his will based on forged criminal documents. If you do not release Emmanuel Griffin into my custody this exact second, I will personally sue this hospital, your parent corporation, and you individually for false imprisonment, medical kidnapping, and criminal conspiracy. You will not only lose your medical license, but you will spend the next decade fighting federal indictments." The hospital director took one look at the Supreme Court seal, looked at the imposing private security team, and immediately stepped aside. He raised his hands in total surrender and instructed the nurses to completely clear the corridor. I did not need the wheelchair anymore. I stood up from the holding bed, rolling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. The frail, confused old man vanished instantly, replaced by the commanding chief executive officer who had built a real estate empire from the ground up. I straightened my jacket, nodded to Jonathan, and walked out of the cell. We bypassed the main hospital lobby entirely. The security contractors escorted me down a restricted staff stairwell, out through the underground loading dock, and directly into the back of a waiting, blacked-out armored sport utility vehicle. We drove off into the night, leaving the hospital far behind us. We did not go to any of my known properties. Jonathan directed the driver to a highly exclusive, heavily fortified luxury hotel in the center of the financial district. The entire penthouse floor had been rented out under a dummy corporation. It was impenetrable off the grid and completely secure. I walked into the sprawling glass-walled suite. The glowing lights of the city I had helped construct spread out below me like a glittering chessboard. Jonathan opened his secure encrypted laptop and placed it on the dining table. "It is time," Emmanuel, Jonathan said quietly, stepping back to give me the floor. I sat down at the keyboard. This was the moment I had prepared for since the very first day I realized the magnitude of my wealth could make me a target. Decades ago, I had instructed my most trusted offshore financial architects to build a highly classified fail-safe mechanism into the foundation of my entire corporate structure. It was an absolute financial kill switch, a cryptographic protocol designed to protect my life's work from hostile corporate takeovers or sudden malicious incapacitation. I logged into the master offshore trust portal using my biometric credentials and a heavily encrypted physical security key. The screen displayed the vast interconnected web of my domestic wealth. I could see the massive joint checking accounts Cynthia controlled, the corporate trust funds Aaliyah had been bleeding dry, and the liquid asset portfolios Connor thought he was about to leverage. They genuinely believed that by locking me in a psychiatric ward, they had gained unhindered access to this kingdom of gold. I typed in a complex 24-character command code. I pressed the Enter key, activating the total freeze order. In a fraction of a second, billions of bytes of data shifted across secure servers located on 3 different continents. Every single dollar, every liquid asset, and every stock portfolio held within the domestic United States was instantaneously legally transferred into a network of untouchable anonymous shell trusts located in non-extradition jurisdictions. The domestic accounts were not just frozen. They were entirely drained, wiped completely clean, and legally locked down by irrevocable offshore mandates. The sprawling financial empire that Cynthia, Connor, Aaliyah, and Xavier thought they were inheriting had just evaporated into thin air. They were left holding the keys to an empty, hollow kingdom. The sun rose the next morning, casting a bright, optimistic light over the city. Across town, Cynthia was executing what she believed to be her final triumphant maneuver. She had discarded her wheelchair the moment I was locked in the hospital. She walked through the heavy brass doors of the largest national bank branch in the city center, wearing a pristine designer pantsuit and carrying a luxury crocodile leather handbag. She marched directly to the premier wealth management desk, exuding the arrogant, untouchable confidence of a woman who had just conquered the world. She slapped the forged medical power of attorney and the fake diagnostic certificate onto the marble counter. The bank teller, a polite young man, reviewed the documents carefully. Cynthia tapped her manicured fingernails against the counter, her eyes shining with greedy anticipation. She demanded an immediate untraceable cashier's check for $3 million to be drawn directly from our primary joint wealth accounts. She needed the massive influx of cash to pay off Xavier's violent loan sharks, satisfy Connor's crushing real estate debts, and secure their absolute financial dominance before any lawyers could potentially intervene. The teller typed the account routing numbers into his secure terminal. He hit the enter key. Cynthia smiled, already tasting the absolute victory she had plotted for so long. Then the teller stopped. He frowned deeply, his eyes scanning the digital monitor in utter confusion. He typed the numbers in again, hitting the keyboard with more force. The screen blinked back the exact same undeniable reality. The teller looked up at Cynthia, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine uncomfortable pity. He cleared his throat nervously and turned the computer monitor slightly so she could see the screen. "I am incredibly sorry, Mrs. Griffin," the teller said softly, pointing to the glowing red numbers on the display. "But the available balance across every single one of these accounts is exactly $0. I watched the high-definition security feed from the comfort of my secure penthouse suite. The microscopic cameras I had planted throughout my estate were broadcasting the absolute collapse of my treacherous family in brilliant real-time clarity." Cynthia had stormed back into the house just minutes after her humiliating defeat at the bank. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind her with enough force to shake the walls. She marched into the center of the living room, her designer handbag discarded on the floor, and let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed through the empty corridors. Connor rushed down the grand staircase, his phone gripped tightly in his pale hand. His arrogant, slick demeanor had completely vanished. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He frantically tapped his screen, logging into his corporate banking portal. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The $2 million commercial loan he had fraudulently secured using my forged signature had indeed been fully executed. The bank had locked his corporate entity into a massive, inescapable debt. But the disbursement ledger showed the funds had bypassed his accounts, entirely vanishing into an untraceable offshore trust. He owed $2 million, and he did not possess a single penny of it. "We are dead!" Connor screamed, gripping his hair in absolute panic. He grabbed a heavy bronze sculpture off the mantelpiece and hurled it directly at the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. The screen shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of black glass, raining down onto Cynthia's prized Persian rug. He drained everything. The accounts are empty. I am personally liable for a $2 million mortgage on a property I do not even own. I am completely bankrupt. Aaliyah and Megan sprinted into the living room, drawn by the sound of breaking glass. Aaliyah pulled out her own phone, her fingers trembling violently as she tried to access the Griffin Educational Foundation portal. Her access was completely denied, but a stark automated federal compliance warning flashed across her screen. She was locked out of the money, but as the newly signed executive director, she was now the sole legal target for the missing $500,000 she had already embezzled. She dropped her phone, her knees giving out as she collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. The luxurious illusion that had bound this toxic alliance together instantly dissolved. Without the promise of my endless wealth to keep them civilized, their primal ugly natures violently surfaced. Megan, the supposedly refined and progressive white daughter-in-law, completely lost her mind. The polite, cultured mask she wore to family dinners fell away, revealing the deep-seated, putrid racism she had harbored all along. She turned her blazing eyes toward Cynthia and Aaliyah, her face contorted with absolute disgust. "You incredibly stupid, incompetent people!" Megan shrieked, her voice echoing with venomous contempt. "I knew I never should have married into this trash family. You promised us millions. You promised us that slum property. My father is going to ruin you for this. You are nothing but ghetto frauds playing dress-up in a mansion you cannot even afford. You let a senile old black man outsmart all of you. You are completely pathetic." Xavier had just walked into the room, his clothes rumpled and his face pale from the mounting terror of his own unpaid gambling debts. Hearing his white wife openly hurl racial insults at his mother and sister severed the final fraying thread of his sanity. The violent syndicate was going to break his legs in less than 48 hours, and now the woman he married was standing in his childhood home spitting on his heritage. Xavier let out a roar of blind, desperate rage. He lunged across the coffee table, his hands outstretched, aiming directly for Megan's throat. Connor intercepted him instantly. He tackled Xavier mid-air, sending both men crashing heavily into the crystal coffee table. The expensive glass shattered beneath their combined weight. A brutal, pathetic physical brawl broke out in the middle of my luxurious living room. They punched, clawed, and tore at each other like rabid dogs fighting over a bone that no longer existed. Blood smeared across the pristine white upholstery as Xavier landed a heavy blow on Connor's jaw. Connor retaliated, driving his knee into Xavier's ribs. Cynthia screamed for them to stop crying hysterically, but her voice was completely ignored. Aaliyah curled into a ball on the sofa, covering her ears to drown out the violent collapse of her entire world. I sat in my penthouse watching the monitors with a cold, analytical detachment. This was the true nature of greed. Money was the only fragile glue that had kept their vicious, selfish personalities in check. Cynthia had spent decades training Aaliyah and Xavier to worship social status and material wealth above honor, loyalty, and family. She raised them to believe that love was transactional and that respect could be bought. Now stripped entirely of the unearned funds required to maintain that spectacular illusion, they immediately reverted to absolute savagery. The mansion filled with imported Italian marble and fine art had simply become a gladiator pit for cowards. They were tearing each other apart because they had absolutely nothing else left. Down on the floor of the living room, Connor finally managed to pin Xavier down, holding him by the collar of his torn shirt. Both men were panting, heavily bruised and bleeding. Connor shoved Xavier aside and staggered to his feet, wiping a streak of blood from his split lip. His pale eyes darted wildly around the ruined room as his frantic mind searched for a final, desperate lifeline. "He is not crazy," Connor gasped out, pointing a trembling finger at Cynthia. "Emmanuel orchestrated this entire thing. He knew about the forgery. He knew about the clinic. He transferred the money himself." Cynthia shook her head frantically. "That is impossible. I had him committed. He is locked inside the psychiatric ward right now." The doctors took him away. "Call the hospital," Connor demanded, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Call them right now." Cynthia scrambled to find her phone among the broken glass. She dialed the hospital administration desk, barking her demands through her tears. I watched her face drain of the last remaining ounces of color as the hospital director informed her of my midnight extraction. She dropped the phone. "He is gone," Cynthia whispered, her voice hollow with terror. "A lawyer and an armed security team came with a Supreme Court order. They took him." Connor's eyes widened with a manic, dangerous desperation. A Supreme Court order means lawyers and lawyers leave a paper trail. If he finalized those wire transfers offshore, it takes 48 hours for international clearinghouses to permanently seal the funds. We still have a window. "What are you talking about?" Aaliyah cried out. "We have no power here." Connor grabbed his phone, his thumb hovering over the dial pad. "We call the police," Connor stated, his voice dropping to a sinister, calculating whisper. "We tell the authorities that a vulnerable, mentally incapacitated old man was violently kidnapped from a hospital by rogue actors. We claim these criminals are currently extorting him and draining his life savings. The police will use emergency tracking to locate his phone or his lawyer. Once they raid wherever he is hiding, we use your medical power of attorney to isolate him. We get him alone in a room and we physically force him to reverse those wire transfers before the money is permanently locked away. Cynthia wiped her tears, a fresh wave of wicked determination settling over her bruised features. She nodded sharply. "Do it," she commanded. "Call 911 right now. Tell them my husband has been abducted and his life is in imminent danger." I smiled coldly at the surveillance screen and leaned back in my leather chair. They were blindly rushing into the final inescapable trap. I reached over and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. Let them bring the police directly to my door. I was absolutely ready for them. Less than 30 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers reflected against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my penthouse suite. I stood perfectly still, watching the chaotic scene unfold on the street level below through the heavy reinforced glass. 4 patrol cars had aggressively barricaded the main entrance of the luxury hotel. My treacherous family spilled out of a taxi, rushing toward the revolving doors alongside a squad of heavily armed uniformed officers. Cynthia was leading the charge. She was clutching the arm of a towering, stern-looking police chief, weeping with an Oscar-worthy level of manufactured hysteria. Even from 20 stories up, I could practically hear her shrill, desperate lies. She was playing the role of the terrified, devoted wife whose mentally vulnerable husband had been violently ripped from a hospital bed by dangerous extortionists. Connor and Xavier flanked her, trying to look like deeply concerned sons, while Aaliyah and Megan trailed behind, their faces pale with the panic of their collapsing financial reality. They were utilizing the sheer force of the local police department as their personal retrieval squad, genuinely believing that a badge and a gun could force me to hand over the offshore routing numbers. I turned away from the window and buttoned the jacket of my suit. It was a flawless charcoal gray bespoke suit tailored to my exact measurements, paired with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. I did not look like a frail, confused patient who had just escaped a psychiatric ward. I looked like the multi-million-dollar corporate executive I had always been. Jonathan Pierce stood by the heavy mahogany door of the penthouse, holding his sleek leather briefcase. He gave me a sharp, confident nod. The hotel manager had just called up, his voice trembling as he informed Jonathan that the police were demanding immediate access to the private elevators under the threat of a tactical raid. I told the manager to grant them full access to the mezzanine lobby. It was time to pull the curtain back on their elaborate, pathetic play. The elevator doors chimed softly as Jonathan and I descended to the mezzanine. The spacious marble-floored lobby was filled with tense, nervous energy. As the polished metal doors slid open, Cynthia's shrieking voice echoed off the high ceilings. She was pointing frantically toward the elevator bank, crying out to the police chief that I was heavily sedated, deeply confused, and completely unable to comprehend my surroundings. She yelled for the officers to arrest the dangerous men who were holding me hostage. I stepped out of the elevator. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, and my gaze was entirely razor-sharp. I walked with the slow, commanding authority of a man who owned the very building he was standing in. Cynthia stopped crying instantly. The fake tears dried on her cheeks as her mouth hung open in absolute shock. Connor took a sudden, involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of a decorative rug. Xavier and Aaliyah froze, staring at me as if they were looking at a ghost. The frail, shuffling old man they had easily bullied in my living room was completely gone. The police chief instinctively rested his hand on his duty belt, stepping forward to intercept me. But before he could issue a single command, Jonathan moved smoothly to my side, presenting a thick red bonded folder directly to the chief. My lawyer did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. He clearly and firmly stated that he was representing my legal interests, presenting the emergency federal injunction signed by the state Supreme Court. He then handed over a pristine certified medical evaluation conducted just weeks ago by 2 independent state board certified psychiatrists, proving unequivocally that I possessed absolute flawless cognitive function. Cynthia tried to recover her shattered performance. She lunged forward, clawing at the air, screaming that the documents were completely fake and that I was suffering from severe dementia. I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes locked onto the police chief as Jonathan pulled a high-definition tablet from his briefcase. Jonathan tapped the screen and held it up for the chief to see. It was the crystal-clear infrared security footage from my underground garage. The video played the exact moment Xavier crawled underneath my vintage luxury sedan with industrial wire cutters. The chief watched in stunned silence as my biological son deliberately and methodically severed the hydraulic brake lines of my vehicle. Jonathan then handed the chief the legally notarized forensic mechanical report from Marcus, confirming the premeditated sabotage. I watched Xavier out of the corner of my eye, all the blood completely drained from his face. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab Connor's shoulder just to remain standing. The sheer suffocating terror of a massive federal attempted murder charge was finally crashing down onto his shoulders. The police chief stared at the tablet, his rigid, aggressive posture shifting immediately. He looked at the Supreme Court seals, the forensic evidence, and then he looked closely at my face. He squinted, his brow furrowing as a spark of deep recognition lit up his eyes. He lowered his hand away from his duty belt. Emmanuel Griffin, the chief, murmured, his voice losing every trace of its previous hostility. "You are the structural engineer who funded the new East Side precinct. You built the primary training facility for our academy." I nodded calmly, extending my hand. "It has been a long time, Chief Harrison. I am glad to see the Tactical Training Center is producing fine officers, though perhaps your dispatch unit should rigorously verify the criminal background of their informants before executing a raid on my private residence." Chief Harrison shook my hand with immediate, profound respect. He had been a rookie patrolman when my company poured the concrete for their massive state-of-the-art precinct. My charitable contributions had single-handedly kept their community outreach programs afloat for over a decade. He realized instantly that he had been aggressively manipulated by a group of desperate, greedy frauds. The chief turned his harsh, unforgiving glare toward Cynthia and my trembling children. The disgust radiating from the veteran police officer was palpable. "Filing a false police report regarding a kidnapping is a severe felony," Chief Harrison stated, his voice booming across the quiet marble lobby. "Attempted murder is a mandatory life sentence in this state. I strongly suggest you all remain exactly where you are. We will be bringing you in for a very long, very detailed interrogation shortly." The chief signaled his squad of officers to stand down. They lowered their defensive postures and stepped back, effectively trapping my treacherous family in a tight, inescapable circle. The police were no longer their personal retrieval squad. They were their heavily armed wardens. Chief Harrison tipped his hat to me, offering a quiet apology for the intrusion, and stepped aside to coordinate with the district attorney over his radio. I was finally left standing face to face with the 5 people who had conspired to steal my fortune, destroy my mind, and end my life. They were completely paralyzed. Megan, the arrogant white daughter-in-law who had mocked my grandfather's land, was physically shaking, hiding behind Connor's arm. Aaliyah stared at the marble floor, her grandiose dreams of high society philanthropy entirely crushed. Cynthia opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to try one last pathetic manipulation, but no sound came out. I stepped closer to them, the silence in the lobby stretching out like a tight wire. I reached into Jonathan's briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal manila folders. I did not hand them over politely. I raised my arm and threw the heavy stack directly onto the marble floor at Cynthia's feet. The sharp, loud slap of the paper hitting the stone echoed like a gunshot. "These are formal eviction notices and immediate asset seizure warrants," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any warmth, pity, or fatherly affection. "The luxury estates you live in, the downtown condominiums, the expensive vehicles you drove here tonight. All of it was financed, co-signed, or directly owned by my holding companies. I have officially called in every single debt and terminated every single lease." Connor let out a choked, desperate gasp. "You cannot do this, Emmanuel. We have nowhere to go." I looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. "You have until exactly 5 o'clock this evening to vacate my properties. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counters, and you will walk out with nothing but the clothes on your backs. If a single one of you is found on my premises at 1 minute past 5, my private security team has strict legal authorization to physically throw you out onto the street. Now get out of my sight before I ask Chief Harrison to arrest you right here in the lobby." They stumbled backward, completely broken by the sheer force of my command. Chief Harrison motioned for his officers to actively escort my former family out of the luxury hotel lobby. I watched through the massive glass windows as they were unceremoniously pushed out onto the busy, unforgiving sidewalk. The reality of their total financial ruin was finally setting in. Connor leaned heavily against a concrete planter, gripping his chest as he gasped for air. The $2 million fraudulent loan he had executed was a ticking time bomb strapped directly to his chest, and he had absolutely no way to defuse it. Megan stood next to him, her face twisted into an ugly mask of panic and rage. I saw her frantically pull her smartphone from her designer purse. She was dialing the one person she believed possessed enough ruthless corporate power to crush me. She was calling her father, Richard Sterling. Richard was the billionaire chief executive officer of Sterling Construction, the massive white-owned development firm that had been aggressively trying to seize my grandfather's land for a luxury shopping mall. Megan paced back and forth on the sidewalk, screaming into the phone. Through my secure intercepted audio feeds, I could hear her spinning a web of hysterical lies. She cried to her father that I had lost my mind, that I had illegally blocked the land transfer, and that I was trying to maliciously bankrupt Connor. Richard possessed the arrogant, unchecked confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. His booming voice echoed through the intercepted call. He told his daughter to wipe her tears. He promised he would use his massive army of corporate lawyers to completely annihilate me and place me under a state conservatorship. He instructed Megan and Connor to meet him at the Sterling Construction headquarters the following morning. He proudly announced that he was going to convene an emergency board of directors meeting to officially launch the hostile takeover of my ancestral land through eminent domain and legal loopholes. They genuinely believed that overwhelming white corporate wealth would save them from the consequences of their own actions. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the top-floor boardroom of Sterling Construction was thick with arrogant celebration. I stood completely out of sight in the sleek marble hallway, listening through the heavy oak double doors alongside my attorney, Jonathan Pierce. Inside, Richard Sterling stood at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. He was addressing his wealthy board members, holding a laser pointer and gesturing toward a massive digital projection on the wall. The screen displayed a pristine, futuristic rendering of a high-end shopping center entirely superimposed over the exact coordinates of my grandfather's sacred land. Megan and Connor sat near the front of the table, their smug, entitled expressions completely restored. They genuinely believed the nightmare was over, and that my defeat was a simple matter of corporate paperwork. Richard loudly boasted to the board about how they were going to acquire the prime real estate for pennies on the dollar by leveraging the mental incompetence of a stubborn, senile old black man. He bragged that the massive profits from this hostile acquisition would completely erase the severe financial deficits his construction company had been secretly suffering from over the past 3 fiscal quarters. He used thinly veiled racist language, calling my neighborhood an urban blight that desperately needed civilized development. He raised a crystal glass of sparkling water to toast his own manufactured brilliance. I did not bother to knock. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with enough force to make them slam against the interior walls. The loud crash echoed through the sprawling boardroom, instantly silencing the celebratory chatter. I strode into the room impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit radiating absolute authority. Jonathan followed closely behind me, carrying a sleek black briefcase. Richard dropped his laser pointer, his face flushing with immediate violent anger at the intrusion. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table and demanded to know how I had bypassed his building security. He ordered his executive assistants to call the guards immediately to physically remove the trespassing old man. Connor shrank back into his leather chair, the color completely draining from his face once again. Megan jumped to her feet, pointing an accusing finger at me, shrieking that I had absolutely no right to be there. I ignored her completely. I walked directly toward the head of the table, my eyes locked entirely on Richard. "You will not be calling security." "Richard," I stated, my voice echoing with a low, dangerous calm that commanded absolute silence in the room. I took my place at the opposite end of the table, resting my hands firmly on the polished wood. Jonathan opened his black briefcase and methodically passed thick red bonded legal folders to every single board member sitting at the table. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving with rage, but a flicker of deep uncertainty sparked in his eyes when he saw the official corporate seals on the documents. Over the last 6 months, Sterling Construction had been quietly hemorrhaging capital due to a series of disastrous, highly leveraged commercial investments. You were on the absolute brink of total corporate bankruptcy. You were miraculously saved just last quarter when an anonymous private equity conglomerate swooped in and purchased exactly 51% of your voting shares. You eagerly took the massive injection of cash without ever questioning the identity of your silent saviors, because your immense greed completely blinded your due diligence. Richard looked down at the red folder in front of him. His hands began to shake as he read the bold print on the very first page. The private equity firm that bought a controlling interest in your sinking ship is a subsidiary of the Griffin Financial Trust. I announced, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the boardroom like a razor. I am the sole executive director and the undisputed majority shareholder of this entire corporation. I own the chair you are sitting in, I own the building we are standing in, and I own every single asset you thought gave you the power to steal my family legacy. The money that saved you from bankruptcy was my money. I bought your entire legacy just so I could have the distinct pleasure of dismantling it right in front of your face. Richard collapsed heavily into his executive chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his absolute defeat. The arrogant, untouchable tycoon had just been reduced to a helpless puppet on my string. The other board members began frantically whispering among themselves, instantly distancing themselves from Richard to save their own lucrative positions. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and delivered the final, crushing blow. As the majority shareholder, I am exercising my unilateral executive authority, I declared firmly. Richard Sterling, your position as Chief Executive Officer is terminated effective immediately. You are officially removed from the Board of Directors and your corporate access is revoked. Furthermore, the proposed commercial development on the South Side property is permanently canceled. My grandfather's land will remain exactly where it belongs. Megan let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair. Her entire world of infinite privilege, unearned wealth, and country club status had just been entirely incinerated. She grabbed her father's arm, begging him to do something, but Richard simply stared blankly at the polished table, completely broken. I turned my cold, unforgiving gaze toward Connor, who was currently hyperventilating, clutching his chest in sheer terror. With the commercial project canceled and your father-in-law entirely stripped of his corporate power, there is absolutely no one left to bail you out. I told him, my words sharp and merciless. You still legally owe the First National Bank $2 million for the fraudulent commercial mortgage you executed yesterday morning. The funds have been permanently rerouted to my offshore accounts and your leverage is totally useless. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life working minimum wage jobs just to pay the compounding interest on a loan you can never possibly escape. You tried to build a life on the stolen blood of my ancestors, and now you will drown in your own manufactured debts. I turned my back on the ruined, pathetic family and walked out of the boardroom with Jonathan by my side. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, leaving them trapped in a massive ocean of inescapable debt and total humiliation without a single path of escape. While Connor and Megan were drowning in the boardroom of their own shattered empire, Aaliyah was executing a desperate, chaotic retreat across town. The automated federal compliance warning that flashed on her smartphone had triggered a primal, suffocating panic. She knew exactly what signing those transfer documents meant now. I had legally bound her to the $500,000 she had ruthlessly siphoned from the Griffin Educational Foundation. The walls of her luxury condominium, a pristine residence paid for with the stolen futures of underprivileged black children, suddenly felt like a rapidly shrinking prison cell. She frantically tore through her custom walk-in closet, discarding the designer gowns and imported silk blouses she had so proudly flaunted at the charity gala. She dragged a massive, heavy leather suitcase onto her king-sized bed and began frantically stuffing it with the only things that mattered to her now: cash and untraceable valuables. She emptied her hidden wall safe, tossing thick stacks of $100 bills, diamond tennis bracelets, and heavy gold watches into the luggage. Her hands shook violently as she booted up her laptop and booked a highly overpriced, one-way first-class ticket to a jurisdiction with incredibly complex extradition treaties. She genuinely believed her wealth and social status would act as an invisible shield against the consequences of her actions. She ordered a private black car service to take her to the international terminal, constantly peering out the tinted windows with wild, paranoid eyes. Every passing police cruiser made her breath catch sharply in her throat. She thought that if she could simply board that flight and put an ocean between herself and the federal jurisdiction of the United States, she could escape my retaliation. She thought she was outsmarting me one final time. Aaliyah arrived at the sprawling international airport, hiding her terrified face behind massive designer sunglasses. She bypassed the standard security lines, marching directly toward the exclusive first-class priority checkpoint, with her heavy suitcase rolling behind her. She handed her passport to the transportation security agent, her polished, manicured fingers trembling slightly against the metal counter. She let out a heavy sigh of relief as the agent scanned her travel documents, believing she was mere minutes away from slipping into the luxurious, untouchable safety of the private departure lounge. But Jonathan Pierce had not simply filed a standard civil complaint. My attorney had delivered a comprehensive, airtight forensic dossier directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The financial trail of the stolen scholarship money was impeccably documented. As the security agent held Aaliyah's passport, two tall men dressed in sharp, unassuming dark suits stepped out from behind a nearby security pillar. They flanked my daughter with swift, inescapable precision. Aaliyah Griffin, the lead agent, stated, his voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, grand larceny, and the federal embezzlement of charitable foundation assets." Aaliyah gasped loudly, stumbling backward into the velvet ropes of the priority lane. She shrieked, demanding they unhand her, threatening to call her expensive corporate lawyers and weaponize her social status to ruin their careers. The agents remained entirely unfazed by her childish temper tantrum. One agent swiftly secured her wrists behind her back, locking heavy steel handcuffs around them with a sharp, echoing click. Dozens of wealthy travelers and international tourists stopped to watch the spectacle. The glamorous, untouchable socialite who had stood on a gala stage just days ago crying fake tears for her dying father was now being walked through the airport concourse in total disgrace. The agents read her Miranda rights as they escorted her out of the terminal. She was not boarding a first-class flight to a tropical sanctuary. She was taking a heavily guarded ride directly to a federal holding facility where her designer clothes would be traded for a standard-issue prison uniform. At the exact same moment Aaliyah was being pushed into the back of a federal transport vehicle, Xavier was facing a drastically different, far more violent kind of justice. The 48-hour deadline issued by the Eastside Gambling Syndicate had completely expired. Stripped of his luxury vehicles, his lavish home, and the protective umbrella of my endless wealth, my biological son had attempted to hide in a decaying, roach-infested motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. He was pacing the stained carpet of the cheap room, sweating profusely, peering through the broken window blinds with wide, bloodshot eyes. He had no cash, no credit cards, and no allies left to exploit. The door to his motel room did not simply open. It was violently kicked off its hinges, the heavy wooden frame splintering into a dozen jagged pieces. 3 massive, heavily tattooed enforcers stepped into the cramped room. They did not carry briefcases or legal documents. They carried heavy steel pipes and the cold, terrifying intent to collect a $150,000 blood debt. Xavier backed up against the peeling wallpaper, raising his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. He wept openly, begging for just one more day, screaming that his sister had money, that his mother could get a loan, that he could find a way to pay them back with massive interest. The lead enforcer stepped forward and delivered a brutal, punishing blow to Xavier's ribs, sending him crashing onto the filthy floor. Gasping for air and spitting blood, Xavier realized with absolute clarity that his life was entirely forfeit. He was completely out of time and completely out of options. In a state of sheer blind panic, he crawled toward his discarded smartphone resting near the foot of the motel bed. With shaking, blood-stained fingers, he dialed the only number he knew held the power to save him from imminent physical destruction. He called the father he had actively tried to murder just days prior. I sat in the quiet, absolute serenity of my secure penthouse office, watching the city lights begin to flicker on in the early evening. My private encrypted smartphone buzzed on the polished mahogany desk. The caller identification prominently displayed Xavier's name. I let it ring 3 times before I calmly pressed the green button and lifted the device to my ear. I did not say a single word. "Dad, please," Xavier screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with hysterical, agonizing terror. "You have to help me. They are going to kill me right now. I am so sorry for the car. I am so sorry for everything. Mom made me do it. Connor manipulated me into going along with the plan. I was just desperate for the cash. Please just wire the money to them. I will do anything you want. I will never ask for another dime. I will disappear completely. Just save me, please." The sound of his weeping echoed through the silent office, a pathetic symphony of a coward facing the direct consequences of his own horrific actions. I felt no pity. I felt no parental instinct to shield him. He had crawled beneath my car with a pair of wire cutters, perfectly willing to send me to a violent, bloody grave just to satisfy his own vile greed and pay for his reckless addictions. I listened to his pathetic, sniveling apologies for exactly 10 seconds, allowing him to fully comprehend that I held his salvation in the palm of my hand. Then I spoke with a voice as cold and hard as a glacier. "A man who digs his own hole must find his own way to climb out," I stated firmly. I pressed the red button terminating the call and permanently severing the final tie to my biological son. I placed the phone face down on the desk, the silence of the room returning beautiful and completely undisturbed. I left the penthouse office and directed my private security driver to take me back to the main estate. The grand house, once a bustling theater for their elaborate deceptions, was now entirely silent and reclaimed by its rightful owner. My private security contractors had already executed my precise orders regarding the property. As my vehicle pulled into the long, circular driveway, I saw the immediate pathetic aftermath of my absolute financial freeze. A battered yellow city taxi idled near the grand iron front gates. The driver was arguing loudly with the passenger, demanding a cash payment because every single platinum credit card had just been viciously declined by the automated banking networks. The passenger door opened, and Cynthia stepped out onto the paved driveway. She did not look like the untouchable, arrogant matriarch who had marched into the National Bank demanding $3 million just 24 hours ago. Her expensive designer pantsuit was severely wrinkled. Her posture, usually so rigidly haughty and commanding, was entirely slumped in defeat. She had been turned away from every luxury hotel in the financial district. Her wealthy socialite friends, sensing the catastrophic radioactive fallout of our massive family collapse, had completely abandoned her to protect their own reputations. She had absolutely nowhere else to run. She was forced to return to the very home she had tried to steal from me. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked slowly up the wide stone steps leading to the front porch. I stood at the top of the landing looking down at the woman I had built my entire life around. She spotted me standing there, and a sudden, desperate flicker of hope ignited in her dark eyes. She genuinely believed that her 40 years of marriage would serve as an impenetrable shield against my wrath. She thought she could simply cry, manipulate my emotions, and seamlessly step back into her role as my beloved ailing wife. She dragged her feet up the driveway, her expensive heels scraping against the gravel as she approached the porch. She reached the bottom of the porch stairs and froze completely. There, stacked haphazardly on the hard stone, were 6 massive designer suitcases. My security team had meticulously packed every single piece of her expensive clothing, her imported jewelry, and her luxury cosmetics. Her entire fraudulent life had been boxed up and physically thrown out of my house. Cynthia looked at the luggage, and the final shreds of her arrogant facade crumbled into dust. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the hard stone steps. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep, letting out loud theatrical sobs that echoed across the quiet, manicured lawn. "Emmanuel, please," Cynthia wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured agony. "You cannot do this to me. We have been married for 40 years. We built this entire life together. I stood by your side when you were working those brutal construction shifts. I am your loyal wife. You know I have been so terribly sick and confused by all these medications." I stood perfectly still, looking down at her pathetic display with a heart made of solid ice. I did not offer my hand. I did not utter a single word of comfort. My absolute silence forced her to scramble for a new defensive strategy. She looked up at me, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick black streaks. "It was not my fault, Emmanuel," she pleaded shamelessly, throwing her own children directly under the bus to save her own skin. "Connor manipulated all of us. He is a greedy, evil man who poisoned Aaliyah against you. And Xavier, your own son, he was so desperate for gambling money that he threatened me. They pressured me into signing those papers. They lied to me. They convinced me you were truly losing your mind and that we needed to protect the estate. I was just a terrified, sick woman trying to protect our family assets from ruin. You have to believe me, my love. I would never intentionally hurt the man who gave me everything. Please just let me come inside. We can fix this mess together. We can go back to the way things were." She reached out, her trembling fingers gripping the fabric of my tailored trousers, begging for the mercy she had aggressively denied me just days ago. I looked down at her hands, clutching my legs. I felt absolutely nothing but profound clinical disgust. I reached into my suit jacket pocket and slowly pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I did not yell. I did not engage in a screaming match to validate her dramatic performance or argue about the past 4 decades. I simply tapped the high-definition screen, opened my secure audio files, and turned the media volume to its maximum capacity. I pressed play. The pristine, unedited recording I had captured from the hidden ceiling microphone in our master bedroom filled the crisp evening air. Cynthia's own voice, completely devoid of any sickness, fragility, or maternal warmth, blasted from the device. "This afternoon, when he returns from the lake, I will ask him to make my special herbal tea. I will have Xavier slip these heavy sedatives into his cup. Once the medication hits his system, he will be completely groggy and incoherent. Do not even ask him to sign. Just take his hand, press his thumb onto the red ink pad, and stamp his fingerprint on every single page of the legal documents." The digital recording stopped. The silence that followed on the front porch was absolute and entirely suffocating. Cynthia dropped her hands from my trousers as if she had been burned. Her mouth hung open, entirely paralyzed by the undeniable, crystal-clear echo of her own ruthless malice. The pathetic weeping victim she was pretending to be instantly evaporated into the cold night air. She stared at the smartphone in my hand, realizing with crushing clarity that her endless psychological manipulation was completely permanently terminated. I looked her directly in the eyes. "You were never sick, Cynthia," I stated, my voice sharp, authoritative, and unforgiving. "Your only terminal disease was an absolute, bottomless greed. You spent 40 years pretending to be my loyal partner while silently plotting to become my ruthless executioner. You looked at the incredible wealth I bled to build for our family and saw nothing but a bank account waiting to be violently drained." I reached inside my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope provided directly by Jonathan Pierce. I dropped it squarely onto the top of her expensive monogrammed luggage. "These are the finalized, expedited divorce proceedings," I announced with lethal finality. "They are accompanied by a comprehensive legal disinheritance mandate filed in federal court. You have been entirely stripped of all spousal support, alimony, and estate rights due to your documented criminal conspiracy and severe elder financial abuse. You will not receive a single penny of my legacy." I turned my back on her and walked up the remaining steps to the heavy oak front door. Cynthia scrambled to her feet, screaming my name, her voice shrill with absolute primal terror as the reality of her total, inescapable poverty finally set in. I stepped into the warm, quiet sanctuary of my home. I did not look back at the woman who had tried to erase my existence. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the massive door firmly shut, locking the steel deadbolt with a loud, echoing snap. I left her screaming on the front porch, entirely alone in the dark, trapped in a nightmare entirely of her own making. The morning after I locked Cynthia out of my life permanently, the local and national media outlets erupted with explosive coverage. Jonathan Pierce had meticulously fed the undeniable forensic evidence, the forged documents, and the audio recordings to top investigative journalists across the entire city. The morning front pages were plastered with glaring, bold headlines declaring the absolute collapse of a fraudulent empire. They detailed the massive embezzlement of the Griffin Educational Foundation, the forged commercial mortgages, and the sickening attempted medical kidnapping of a prominent black real estate developer. The public humiliation was absolute and entirely inescapable. The high society elite who had sipped champagne at Aaliyah's charity gala just weeks prior now publicly scrambled to aggressively distance themselves from my disgraced family. The swift, heavy gears of the federal justice system began to grind them all into dust. The very first domino to officially fall in a court of law was Dr. Harrison Vance. The arrogant fraternity brother who had dared to declare me severely demented for a $10,000 cash bribe was now sitting at the defense table in a federal courtroom. I sat in the front row of the public gallery, dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, watching the absolute terror wash over his pale, sweating face. He was facing multiple felony charges, including federal medical fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. The federal prosecutor did not even need to raise his voice during the opening statements. He simply played the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured from my living room ceiling, broadcasting Vance greedily accepting the cash bribe from Connor and laughing maliciously about stealing my freedom. The entire courtroom listened in stunned, breathless silence. The presiding judge glared down at the defense table with absolute disgust. Vance stared at the polished wooden desk, physically shaking, realizing that his medical license, his lucrative career, and his freedom were entirely incinerated in a matter of seconds. Faced with an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable digital evidence and the terrifying prospect of a 20-year federal prison sentence, Dr. Harrison Vance completely folded. He did not possess a single ounce of loyalty to Connor or my family. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to secure a plea deal and avoid the maximum penalty, Vance took the witness stand and eagerly confessed to the entire sprawling fraud ring. He meticulously detailed how Connor had orchestrated the medical certificate scheme from the very beginning. He testified about the forged power of attorney, the coordinated manipulation of my health records, and the precise timeline of their financial conspiracy. He handed the federal prosecutors a complete, undeniable roadmap to Connor's criminal enterprise, explicitly naming him as the primary architect of the entire operation. The swift, brutal arm of federal justice swung directly toward my son-in-law. Less than 48 hours after Vance's damning sworn testimony, a heavily armed team of federal agents raided the cheap temporary highway motel room where Connor had been hiding since I evicted him from my luxury properties. The slick, arrogant real estate broker who thought he could steal the legacy of a black family to fund his lavish lifestyle was violently yanked out of his filthy bed. The federal agents slammed him against the peeling motel wallpaper, locking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists with a sharp, echoing click. He was formally indicted for federal forgery, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy. As he was marched out into the glaring morning sunlight wearing a wrinkled undershirt and gym shorts instead of his custom-tailored designer suits, the local news cameras captured his total spectacular disgrace. He was entirely bankrupt, facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary and still legally anchored to the crushing $2 million commercial debt he had fraudulently signed his own name to. The bank was already initiating aggressive asset seizure protocols against his remaining shell companies. With Connor sitting in a federal holding cell and her father's construction empire completely dismantled by my hostile corporate takeover, Megan found herself entirely stripped of her unearned white privilege. The immense wealth and social armor she had wielded like a weapon to look down upon my family and mock my grandfather's land had simply evaporated into thin air. The corporate creditors relentlessly pursued her for the massive residual debts Connor had accumulated. She was forced to swiftly liquidate every single piece of designer jewelry, her luxury handbags, and her expensive vehicles just to avoid immediate criminal prosecution for tax evasion and asset hiding. Her wealthy country club friends completely blocked her phone number, treating her like a highly contagious disease. The high society world she worshipped had permanently shut its pristine doors in her face. Several weeks later, I asked my private security driver to take me to a small, rundown commercial district on the far west side of the city. I walked into a cheap, greasy roadside diner that smelled heavily of stale coffee and burnt frying oil. The floors were sticky, and the neon signs buzzing in the window were flickering and broken. I sat at a small, cramped corner booth and ordered a simple cup of black coffee from the kitchen counter. A few moments later, a waitress approached my table holding a stained plastic pitcher. It was Megan. She was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform, her hair tied back in a messy, exhausted knot, completely devoid of her expensive cosmetics and arrogant sneer. She looked entirely broken and defeated, the harsh reality of grueling physical labor etching deep lines into her face. When she looked down to pour the coffee and recognized my face, the glass pitcher slipped from her trembling hands. It hit the linoleum floor, shattering into a dozen pieces and splashing hot liquid across her cheap work shoes. The diner manager immediately shouted at her from the kitchen, threatening to dock her pay for the broken glass. The arrogant, racist woman who had once stood backstage at a gala and demanded that my ancestral land be bulldozed into a parking lot was now dropping to her knees, frantically wiping up a sticky mess with a dirty rag. She was serving the exact working-class people she used to viciously despise, trapped in a minimum wage, reality she could never escape. I did not mock her. I did not hurl insults or demand an apology. I did not say a single word. I simply left a crisp $20 bill on the laminated table, stood up, and walked out of the diner. The crushing, undeniable reality of her pathetic existence was a far more punishing and permanent sentence than any words I could ever speak. I returned to the quiet, serene comfort of my sprawling estate, feeling a profound and absolute sense of victory. The complete destruction of their toxic, fraudulent empire had been executed flawlessly. I had not thrown a single physical punch. I had not raised a weapon, nor had I lowered myself to the chaotic, violent desperation of men like Xavier or the petty, screaming tantrums of Cynthia. I had used the immense, undeniable power of ironclad contracts, forensic audits, and the relentless machinery of the federal legal system to dismantle them, piece by agonizing piece. I had utilized my sharp intellect, extreme patience, and the unbreakable legacy of my grandfather's hard work to outmaneuver every single trap they aggressively set for me. They genuinely believed my advanced age made me weak and compliant, but they failed to understand that decades of surviving and conquering a deeply prejudiced corporate world had forged my mind into an absolute weapon. The punishment they were currently enduring was not an act of blind emotional vengeance. It was the precise mathematical application of justice. They had actively dug a massive, inescapable pit of greed, racism, and betrayal, and I simply stepped aside and allowed the full weight of the legal system to bury them securely inside it. A few months after the dust settled and the final prison sentences were handed down, a new, entirely different kind of challenge arrived at my doorstep. It was not a fraudulent scheme or a desperate, greedy family member looking for a handout. It was a formal, highly official delegation from the city government. 3 well-dressed municipal officials and a senior urban development commissioner sat across from me in my secure penthouse boardroom. They unrolled a massive set of glossy blueprints and placed a pristine, legally binding purchase offer directly on the mahogany table. The city was launching a massive multi-billion-dollar public infrastructure initiative to revitalize the entire southern district. They needed my grandfather's 50 acres of land to serve as the primary commercial anchor for the sprawling project. The commissioner pushed the heavy contract toward me, his eyes gleaming with bureaucratic confidence. He pointed a manicured finger to the purchase price listed on the second page. It was an astronomical figure. It was nearly triple the current market value of the property, a sum so large it would instantly elevate my already massive net worth into an entirely new, unimaginable financial stratosphere. The commissioner confidently explained that this was a legacy-defining payout. It was an opportunity to cash out completely and walk away with absolute generational wealth without lifting another finger. I stared down at the crisp white paper, feeling the profound heavy weight of the moment pressing against my chest. I had just spent agonizing months ruthlessly battling my treacherous son-in-law, my vicious daughter-in-law, and my own biological children to protect this exact piece of soil from their greedy, racist commercial development plans. I had systematically destroyed their entire lives to keep that land safe from arrogant white corporate bulldozers. And now the local government was sitting in my private office offering to do the exact same thing. But this time they were offering to pay me a completely legitimate, staggering fortune to look the other way and hand over the deed. It was the ultimate financial temptation. It was a profound test of my absolute core values. I closed my eyes for a brief second and pictured my grandfather. I saw his scarred, heavily calloused hands. I saw the blood he shed, the relentless physical labor he endured, and the racial terror he navigated during the brutal Jim Crow era just to secure a permanent physical foundation for our family. He bought that land in a country that actively wanted to destroy him, ensuring we would always have a place to stand. I opened my eyes, picked up the thick purchase contract, and slid it directly back across the polished table toward the stunned commissioner. I told them in a calm, immovable voice that the land was absolutely not for sale. I explained that no amount of municipal funding, tax incentives, or corporate capital could ever place a monetary value on the blood and sweat of my ancestors. The city officials were completely speechless, unable to comprehend a businessman turning down a guaranteed historic fortune. I escorted them out of my penthouse completely resolute in my decision. That very same afternoon, I summoned Jonathan Pierce and my top architectural firm to the estate. I laid out a completely different set of blueprints on the table. I was not going to let the land sit idle, nor was I going to hand it over to politicians and commercial developers. I was going to transform my grandfather's sacred 50 acres into a permanent, thriving monument for our people. I personally funded the construction of a massive state-of-the-art community and vocational training center. I poured millions of my own liquid offshore capital into building cutting-edge workshops for electrical engineering, commercial plumbing, advanced carpentry, and heavy machinery operation. I wanted the young black men and women of the South Side to learn the exact same tangible, highly lucrative trades that allowed me to build my original construction empire from nothing. I wanted them to own their labor, dictate their own professional worth, and build their own independent wealth without relying on a system designed to hold them back. Alongside the sprawling vocational workshops, I constructed a vast interactive historical library dedicated entirely to the forgotten black pioneers, master builders, and civil rights leaders of our city. I wanted every single teenager who walked through those heavy glass doors to know exactly whose shoulders they were standing on. I spent the next year personally overseeing every single phase of the construction, standing in the dirt with a hard hat, watching my true legacy rise from the ground. As the sprawling facility finally neared completion, I realized I needed a director of security whom I could trust implicitly. I did not want a faceless corporate security agency guarding this sacred sanctuary. I needed a man of absolute proven integrity. I instructed my private security team to track down Stan, the older parking lot guard from the medical clinic. He was the brave man who had pulled me aside on that fateful Tuesday afternoon and showed me the security footage of Cynthia walking perfectly fine in her designer heels. That single, terrifying moment of unprompted honesty had saved my life, my sanity, and my entire fortune. My team found Stan working a grueling double shift at a poorly funded municipal hospital just to make ends meet and pay for his granddaughter's college tuition. I drove my vehicle to his small, modest home on the east side of the city. When I knocked on his door, he looked completely exhausted, his uniform stained and heavily worn from years of thankless labor. I did not offer him a simple thank you card or a basic cash reward. I handed him a heavily bound premium employment contract. I offered him the position of Chief Director of Security for the new community center. The contract included a massive life-changing salary, comprehensive premium medical benefits, a fully funded retirement pension, and a dedicated 4-year university scholarship completely paid in full for his bright granddaughter. Stan read the numbers on the page, his calloused hands shaking violently as heavy tears of pure, overwhelming gratitude streamed down his weathered face. He had taken a massive personal risk by showing a wealthy, powerful stranger that security footage expecting absolutely nothing in return. He simply wanted to do the right thing because he was a good man. That small, genuine act of courage had effectively dismantled a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. Rewarding his quiet, steadfast honor was the easiest and most fulfilling financial decision I have ever made in my entire life. The grand opening ceremony of the community center took place on a bright, beautiful Saturday morning. I stood on the massive, elevated wooden stage built directly over the exact spot where my grandfather had once parked his rusted, broken-down tractor decades ago. The sprawling, newly paved courtyard was packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of people from the local neighborhood. There were no toxic family members lurking in the shadows, no greedy children waiting to steal my fortune, and no manipulative wife plotting my violent demise. Instead, I was surrounded by a massive sea of bright, eager, and deeply appreciative faces. Local business owners, young students holding their new tool belts, and wise community elders cheered loudly as I stepped up to the microphone. Stan stood proudly at the edge of the stage in his crisp, custom-tailored security uniform, watching over the massive crowd with absolute vigilance and pride. I looked out at the massive facility, admiring the shining glass, the strong brick walls, and the powerful legacy that would outlive me for generations. I raised the heavy ceremonial golden scissors to cut the thick red ribbon, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace radiating through my entire body. The crowd erupted into a deafening, joyous roar of absolute respect, the sound echoing beautifully across the very land my family had bled to keep. The morning air is crisp and clean, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the expansive garden I now tend with my own 2 hands. I am 75 years old today, and the heavy, suffocating weight of my turbulent past has completely lifted from my broad shoulders. I sit in my custom oak rocking chair on the sprawling front porch of my estate, the very same stone porch where I once locked my treacherous ex-wife out of my life forever. The property is no longer a silent, hostile fortress filled with hidden cameras, intercepted phone calls, and whispered conspiracies. It has been transformed into a genuine, peaceful sanctuary. I unfold the daily city newspaper, savoring the simple, tactile pleasure of the crisp pages turning between my fingers. The bold headlines are focused on local politics and a massive, newly funded expansion of the community center I built on my grandfather's sacred land. The center has just proudly graduated its 4th consecutive class of master electricians and commercial plumbers. Seeing the bright, hopeful faces of those young black men and women printed in the local business section brings a profound, untouchable smile to my face. As I flip past the metropolitan section, my eyes catch a small buried legal notice in the back columns of the judicial updates. It is a brief bureaucratic update regarding the state penitentiary parole board hearings. Seeing those dense legal briefs no longer triggers a spike of defensive adrenaline or a wave of righteous anger in my chest. It simply serves as a quiet, distant reminder of the surgical precision I utilized to eradicate the toxic infection that once threatened to consume my entire existence. The past occasionally knocks on my door through these small printed updates, but it no longer holds a single ounce of power over my mind. I read the names and the court dates with the cold, detached interest of a man reading a history book about a brutal war he definitively won a long time ago. My biological son, Xavier, recently lost his first and only criminal appeal. He is currently serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a medium-security state facility for his desperate, reckless involvement with the illegal gambling syndicate and his documented violent role in the extortion plot against his own family. Stripped entirely of his custom-tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his unearned arrogance, he now spends his days working in the sweltering prison laundry room. He is finally learning the brutal, inescapable reality of the manual labor he once so arrogantly mocked. Aaliyah managed to avoid a lengthy federal prison term by aggressively cooperating with the authorities and testifying against her former husband, Connor. However, the federal judge showed her absolutely zero leniency regarding her massive financial ruin. She was stripped of every single stolen asset, her luxury condominium was seized, and she was sentenced to 5,000 hours of grueling, heavily supervised community service. The former high society socialite who once threw lavish galas with embezzled funds now spends her weekends picking up trash along the county highways wearing a bright orange reflective vest for the entire city to see. Cynthia, the woman who spent 4 decades pretending to be my loving, devoted partner, met the most poetic and agonizing fate of all. After her absolute legal disinheritance and her spectacular public shunning, she was forced into a tiny, cramped, government-subsidized apartment complex on the far, undesirable edge of the city limits. She lives in total agonizing obscurity. There are no imported silk robes, no catered dinners, and absolutely no audience left to manipulate with her fake theatrical illnesses. She spends her days staring out a dirty window, completely isolated, abandoned by the wealthy friends she worshipped, and permanently ignored by the children she poisoned against me. They all gambled my life for a shortcut to massive wealth, and the house mercilessly collected every single one of their chips. People often ask me how I managed to completely sever ties with my own flesh and blood without breaking down entirely. They assume that family is an unbreakable sacred bond that must be fiercely preserved regardless of the emotional or financial cost. But that is a highly dangerous toxic fallacy created exclusively to keep victims bound to their abusers. I learned the hardest, most devastating lesson a patriarch can ever learn. Sharing a bloodline does not grant anyone a free pass to exploit, manipulate, or violently destroy your spirit. When a skilled surgeon discovers a malignant, aggressive tumor growing inside a patient, they do not hesitate to cut it out. They do not leave the cancer inside the body simply because it developed from the patient's own cells. They take a sharp scalpel, they excise the poison entirely, and they throw it directly into the incinerator so the rest of the healthy body can survive. Cynthia, Xavier, Aaliyah, and their greedy spouses were a massive coordinated malignancy actively eating away at my legacy, my fortune, and my sanity. I had to become the ruthless surgeon of my own life. I had to wield the heavy, terrifying scalpel of absolute refusal. There is a staggering, monumental power in learning how to say the word no. It is the most vital, life-saving word in the human vocabulary. Saying no to relentless financial extortion. Saying no to calculated emotional manipulation. Saying no to the suffocating guilt that toxic family members weaponize to drain your bank accounts and your energy. I abruptly stopped blindly funding their lavish lifestyles, and in doing exactly that, I forced them to reveal their true, monstrous faces. The very moment you stop allowing yourself to be a walking financial resource, you instantly discover who actually loves you and who was simply on your payroll. Cutting them off was incredibly painful at first, a sharp, searing agony that echoed through my chest in the dark, lonely hours of the night. But that initial pain was absolutely nothing compared to the slow, agonizing death of dying by 1,000 cuts from their endless, wicked deception. I actively chose the sharp pain of amputation over the terminal illness of their endless greed, and by cutting away the deep rot, I allowed my soul to finally breathe, heal, and truly live. I fold the morning newspaper neatly and set it down on the small, polished wooden table next to my rocking chair. I stand up, my back perfectly straight, my legs incredibly strong, completely free of the fake shuffling gait I once used to trap them in their own web of lies. I walk back into my bright sunlit kitchen, a space now filled only with peace. I pull a delicate porcelain teacup from the glass cabinet and place a fresh chamomile tea bag inside. I pour the boiling water over the fragrant herbs, watching the golden liquid swirl and steep perfectly. I do not have to look over my shoulder in my own home. I do not have to check the bottom of the cup for heavy chemical sedatives or crushed, dangerous pills. I do not have to constantly wonder if the person sitting across from me is secretly plotting my physical demise for an insurance payout. I carry the hot porcelain teacup back out onto the front porch. The morning sun warms my face, casting a bright golden glow over the immaculate quiet grounds of my secure estate. I bring the rim to my lips and take a long, slow sip. The tea is perfectly hot, remarkably clean, and completely pure. There are absolutely no lies hidden in the water. There is only the beautiful, absolute, and flawless silence of my hard-earned freedom. If this painful journey has taught me anything else, it is the true definition of a legacy. I once believed that simply handing down massive wealth to my children would secure their futures and forge them into honorable people. I was completely wrong. Unearned wealth does not build character. It only breeds lethal entitlement and insatiable greed. Real legacy is not a trust fund or a sprawling commercial real estate portfolio. True legacy is taking your hard-earned resources and actively using them to uplift those who are genuinely willing to work for their own salvation. If my journey has inspired you to protect your own peace, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of survival and strength.